Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode here. My name is Dave Tilley. I am the CEO of Shifts, and for those who maybe are not familiar, I was a collegiate gymnast, and I now work as a sports physical therapist, a strength conditioning coach, a researcher, and then also someone who kind of is in the field working as a strength conditioning coach, trying to help out the best that I can. So I work up in Boston at a facility called Champion Physical Therapy and Performance, but with Shift, I try to do a lot of education. And for those that are maybe joining this or seeing this for the first time, this is part of a very large series where I have an audacious goal to try and do a nice big bird's eye view overview of kind of a certain joint or a certain area of the body that's frequently injured in gymnastics. And so we have done many other different versions of this, but I wanted to make sure there were some complete guides out there that people could reference if they stumble upon having an injury, or they have questions, or they're trying to look at, what can be done to help mitigate or reduce some of the injuries that happen in these joints commonly. So we previously did the ankle joint, which was very well received. And so my goal here is to kind of continue to work through each joint and to try to go in order of what joint gets injured the most based on the research. And kind of at the end of this, over the course of 2 months, is really have, 7 or 8 standalone podcasts and very large blog posts that really summarize things for people and can be used as a resource, a very high quality, science-based, evidence-based resource for the gymnastics community. And so if you're listening to this on podcast form, keep in mind, you can also check this out in video form if you want to watch and see some of the stuff as I go through it. But more importantly, if you're really curious about this, we have a very large free blog post, which is up on Shift's website. So shiftmovementscience.com/articles. And you can search for these blog posts, and it really lays out everything from head to toe. So what I'm saying here in the podcast is written form, but it also has, links to the research and links to the different ideas that I think are really important, some videos built in, some different graphs built in, all that kind of stuff. So I will try my best here to go through the knee joint. And what we're going to do is really be comprehensive, but at the same time, not overwhelming. And so I want to make sure that this is something that's accessible for everyone inside the gymnastics community. So we're not going to go way too far on one side of being extremely nerdy, extremely medical, extremely geeky. But we're also not going to go all the way to the other side, which is maybe oversimplification of certain topics. I want to make sure that we strike that midpoint between outlining the important things that are relevant, but also not boring people, and also not going on the other side, which is making it so simple that it's really hard to understand the different factors that go into these different ideas or injuries, or how to help out with them. So I think the first one with the ankle podcast really struck that midpoint well. People say it resonated quite well. So we'll talk about knees today. And then in future episodes, we are going to kind of continue with this and talk about low back. Then we'll talk about hip, then shoulder, and then the elbow and the wrist together, so that we have a really good big, buffet here of different podcasts and things that people can keep coming back to. Okay. So with that being said, I think the knee joint is got a lot of similarities for the ankle joint, because they are both involved in impact. That's the primary kind of mechanism of what causes many common injuries in gymnastics. However, the knee joint is very different than the ankle for many reasons. Okay. And we'll talk about these more in depth, but one of which is that if you look at the research, the knee joint has the highest rate of what are called severe injuries in gymnastics. Okay. And so what we mean by that is that they do have a lot of overuse type issues that we're going to go into, but many of the things that happen in gymnastics for the knee joint, unfortunately, come at a much more serious cost. Okay. So by serious injuries, what we mean in the research is that they tend to have more tissue damage. They have more overall injury, right? So say if you land and you say, example, hyperextend your knee, that typically comes with more problems and more long-term challenges than someone who just rolls their ankle. because the forces on the knee joint maybe sometimes damage connective tissue or ligaments more easily than in the ankle or say other areas of the body. Okay. So the reason I say that to start with is not to start on a negative note, but it's to really highlight how important this information is for us to in some cases, make some really drastic changes to the way we approach strength and conditioning and the way we approach some of the landing techniques that we'll talk about. Okay. Because when you say severe injuries, they come with the most cost, but also if you look at the research, it also shows that these injuries take the most time to recover from. Okay. So a couple good studies to look at here are CARE in 2015, which was in the NCAA, and then a great textbook that Emily Sweeney edited that I was really fortunate to be a part of, right? The rehabilitation chapter for gymnastics. In those articles and in those chapters are really good summaries of evidence. And what we see there is that the most damage done sometimes is coming in the knee joint, and they take the most time to recover from. So they are unfortunately really devastating sometimes. Even overuse type injuries can really plague somebody throughout their career. But these issues also have quite a bit of time missed from competition or practice, and they tend to really carry with people towards the rest of their life, right? There's a lot of unfortunately good reports of people saying, my knees always bother me after I had an ACL tear injury in college, or I continue to have problems when I'm older. So these things are not only devastating when they happen, they could also be really problematic for the continued, rest of someone's life as they go down through the next few years after college or into their 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever. Okay. So that being said, right, you have to look at epidemiological studies and see, okay, how prevalent are these things? And so when you look at research, great study from Ellington 2019, Ramos 2019, and Kessler 2018, which we'll provide the links to on the blog in very in-depth form with links to everything if you want to find these studies. Anywhere between 5.1 to 26.2% of the injuries occur in the knee joint. So when you take a big step back and you look at the overall incidence of, knee joint issues, what you see is that up to about a little over 25%. So a quarter of the injuries happen related to the knee joint. And so that's really concerning, right? If something is a quarter of our overall problem, I think that's something we really seriously need to take a look at. Right? The ankle joint, ankle sprains, as we talked about in the last episode, are probably the most common because they happen the most frequently, but the knee joint is very close behind. Okay. And a reason why this happens, again, is because a lot of it comes down to impact. And it also comes down to the amount of force that goes on the lower body of a gymnast. When they land, when they run, when they punch, when they tumble, all that kind of stuff adds up really, really quickly. All right. So with that in mind, you then you try to understand what is happening inside of the knee joint. And we get into a little bit of a problem here, particularly with overuse type injuries, where the categories that we use to name some of these injuries are really, really challenging and they're not really helpful. Okay. And so I'm really fortunate that my boss, Mike Reinold, and Lenny Macrina, both my bosses and mentors, were part of the group in Alabama that really started to unpack this and really break down why this is not a great idea to approach, generalized knee pain, these terms such as like patellofemoral pain or synovitis, right? Or internal derangements, right? Sometimes using these words are, a good way to kind of wrap your head around what's going on, but it does not really help you in terms of specifically breaking down why someone is having knee pain. And as a result, if we don't have a good diagnosis, it's challenging to have a very specific treatment plan that is going to help that person get back, right? And so this happens often where someone gets a generalized patellofemoral pain disorder. And within that, you don't know what's causing their pain per se. And so you don't have a great rehab program. So what happens is they kind of get back and they kind of go through a rehab process, but it never really gets fully back. And so they get a re-injury or they continue to have problems, right? Or they don't really know the best exercises to help out. So these terms are sometimes really not helpful in terms of classification. So we need to be better about breaking down what these different types of subsets of knee injuries are, whether that's related to the actual, kneecap joint itself or other injuries that happen around the knee. And so I will do my best to summarize what I have found really, really helpful from learning from Mike and from learning from Lenny and from learning from many other people inside the field who are amazing. But also there's some really classic papers by Kevin Wilk and George Davies and stuff like that we'll put in the show notes and we'll add to the blog, that if you're trying to wrap your head around what's going on, it's really beneficial to read these papers and understand the anatomy to then understand what can be done to help these injuries. Okay. If you don't understand the basics of the joint, you don't understand how these injuries occur, it's really challenging sometimes to get a good rehab program. All right. So with that being said, when we look a little bit deeper, one more layer, we break up, okay, what is the big picture of different types of injuries? The first classification that you can do is you're going to have acute injuries, and then you're going to have overuse injuries. Okay, so acute injuries are typically a one-time event. They're a bit more severe, and they typically happen with like an accident or a situation where something just, they land wrong or they land funky and it causes something to hurt all of a sudden. There's many unfortunate parts of gymnastics that are purely just inherently risky, right? With so many jumping and landing occurrences that happen in gymnastics, it's very, very easy to have a knee hyperextend or land funky or land really in a deep squat right? And be under rotated and stress your knee. So unfortunately, those happen in every sport. It's not just gymnastics, but that does happen quite a bit in gymnastics. But when you look at research, most of what's going on actually is going to be more overuse or a repetitive type injury. So these are going to be the overuse or chronic type injuries where things slowly start to get bad and they stay worse, then something happens and it really pushes somebody over the edge. And it's a little bit tough here because you can have progressive overuse injuries that are then leading to an acute injury, right? What I mean by that is to say, for example, someone always lands in a not great position, or maybe they're not quite strong enough to handle the forces. When they're younger, they can have, their meniscus maybe gets irritated. They land and they kind of pivot a little bit funky and they tweak their knee. It gets a little bit better, but then they keep going. It's a little bit better, keeps going. And then maybe they land again, but because the knee joint is maybe a little sore or there's some strength deficits there, they land and it really goes into a bad position and it causes a full meniscus tear, right? So the meniscus tear itself is an acute injury, but there was kind of some chronic repetitive overuse that was leading up to that, okay? And this happens a lot sometimes too with fractures or stress fractures or cartilage issues, whereas there's a progressive overuse, but then at one instance, something happens and it causes a bigger injury that then requires an extended period of time off or surgery or something like that. So I think, like I said in the beginning, the rate of severe injuries is unfortunately most common in the knee joint with ACL tears or fractures or really aggressive hyperextension injuries or landing weird with your knee caving in and causing an injury. That does happen a lot. But when you see things from a bigger picture, what we see is that a lot of this repetitive overuse and this chronic kind of low level irritation that snowballs maybe over the course of a season or multiple years, it sets somebody up to have a really challenging injury when down the road it finally, unfortunately gives way or something happens. And so the reason I'm belaboring this point is because if a lot of these things are slow and progressive and accumulating injuries, we have to do a really, really, deep dive into why those things are happening. And we also have to be really kind of honest, brutally honest with ourselves inside the culture about what are we missing. What are we missing from a coaching point of view? What are we missing from a medical rehab point of view? What are we missing from a research point of view? What do we need to do to change the modifiable factors? There's many that we can affect that will help out with this. Okay. And that's kind of the goal of this podcast, is to outline what some of those things are and then say, what can we do about it? But then also provide people with a nice 4-stage framework to get back after an injury occurs in the knee. And I'll share everything under the sun that I can to try to help people. All right. So let's then break down first, what are some of the contributing factors to why there are so many knee injuries in gymnastics? Okay. So we're going to kind of go through these at a bigger picture, and then we'll circle back at the end and talk about what we can do to really implement some of these changes. Okay. The most obvious, the most clear, low-hanging fruit that I think many people unfortunately don't want to just admit the reality of is that the forces in gymnastics are absolutely astronomical, right? If you look at research, anywhere between 15 to 18 times your body weight is what those ground reaction forces are. Okay. So when you land, that is the force that is experienced by the body, right? And I'm not saying it all goes to the knee joint, right? Obviously it goes across the ankle, the knee, the hip, the core, everything, multiple muscles and structures. But the frank reality is that we are in a sport that has just unbelievably high force. Okay. And it's hard to conceptualize when you're watching someone do skills when they land that force is happening to them. Okay. But if you were to take, a barbell and load it up with a whole bunch of weight and watch somebody jump off a box and squat and land, you'd be like, oh, wow, that looks like a ton of weight. Right. And you have to kind of wrap your head around that. That's kind of what the body experiences. Right. So that 15 to 18 times body weight, I mentioned in the ankle joint episode that the highest recorded force we have is about 23 times body weight. And that was at the takeoff of a double back. So the ankle joint and the back handspring takeoff. So those are in controlled lab settings, which is really important to mention, because they're not the most risky situations that gymnasts find themselves in, right? The double pike that lands under rotated on floor because someone's tired, or the 2.5 that's kind of a 2.25 and the knee kind of is twisted a little bit, or a double that lands just a little bit short off high bar, right? And they're under rotated, but all the way down to compulsory level gymnastics, right? Just bouncing on a trampoline for young trampoline gymnasts, right? Or doing standing back tucks when you're little on low beam, or doing, just punch fronts on the actual spring floor when you're really, really young and you're maybe not strong enough yet. Those forces are relative to the athlete and their body weight. So it's not like you don't experience those forces until you're 15, then all of a sudden you go through it and now you're doing harder skills. Younger athletes are experiencing this same proportionate amount of force And that's why we have so many challenging issues such as Osgood Schlatters or, patellar tendon issues or stress fractures and stuff like that. So that's kind of really important to talk about first. And quickly related to this is going to be the brutal honesty is that we still have a sport that is not teaching and using the safest landing patterns to absorb these forces. And I kind of saved this for later in the last podcast, but I think it's so important to mention here straight out of the gate is that if we have really high forces, we need to be using the most science supported ways to help teach athletes to buffer those forces, right? To mitigate those forces going through their joints and using muscles, which we can increase the strength of to help improve the ability to tolerate those issues over and over and over again. Okay, so I was a victim of this as a younger coach, younger medical provider. Like I totally understand this, but the science has so significantly changed in the last 10 years around what we can do to help teach proper landing patterns. Okay, Tim Hewitt is a massive researcher here, but also Kevin Wilk, James Andrews, Rafael Escamilla, again, Mike Rhino, Lenny Macrina. There's many, many people who have been just giants in the field of doing really great research in the ACL world in particular. Lynn Snyder Mackler is another one who's got great research out there. She's doing phenomenal work. You have to take all of these things and take a step back out of your gymnastics bubble and realize that there's probably a safer way to land here. Okay, and we'll break that down more, but you look at the sport in general, and we still see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young athletes being taught to land with their knees together and their feet together and their hips tucked under and a very low knee bend. There's not a lot of bending going on. That is a ton of stress on the knee. And it's called a quad dominant or a knee dominant landing strategy in the ACL research. And it's very, very concerning for not only the force that it puts on the joint, but also setting somebody up for the risk of having a serious injury like an ACL issue or an MCL issue, a tear of the ACL or MCL or a meniscus problem. So we want to really make sure that we outline clearly what is the more ideal way to land to handle these forces, along with teaching that to kids and using that and making sure the judging criteria backs up that someone's not going to get deducted when they land in a way that protects themselves against injury. Okay. So that one goes right along with it is that the high forces are very real and they're very, very current. The landing patterns that we use to navigate those forces are sometimes not being optimally taught and used and supported and judged for. Okay. And then the next thing around that is that we have a crazy amount of repetitive impact in our sport. Okay. Every sport has the nature of the beast you have to deal with repetitively, right? So throwing, obviously, the throwing motion in baseball, or running, right? An impact in running sports, long distance sports, or in certain sports that are more related to gymnastics, but have impact volleyball, basketball. They too experience these forces over and over and over again, right? Everything you can think about rowing has repetitive, like rowing and bending over of the lower back, right? Like every sport has its inherent beast. And in gymnastics, it is the fact that the skills are so challenging and they're so hard to learn and master that you have to do a ton of repetitions to learn them, right? And I think the problem here mainly comes up is a couple things. One is that we really have no evidence-based way to monitor how many impacts someone is taking throughout a week, a month, a competitive season, a year. We don't really know how many gymnasts are doing, right? And I made this joke with a colleague of mine saying that essentially because we haven't had enough research to look at this and track this well practically, it's like we're trying to fly an airplane without any gas gauge or speedometer or instruments to measure altitude. Like you're really flying blind sometimes about trying to properly build up the right amount of workload to get somebody prepared and stronger, right? And the right dosage of impact and strength conditioning is beneficial, and it helps the athlete get stronger, get ready for the meet season. So we want to train hard. We want to make sure we're intelligently doing challenging programs. But if we don't have some way to measure what we're doing, somebody can easily take 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000 impacts over the course of a month. And we don't know how that is in relation to the month before. And that's mainly how a lot of these injuries come up. Shin splints, Sever's disease, Sinden, Jarsen, Lohanssen issues, patellar tendon issues in older athletes. A lot of this does come down to a mismanagement or not understanding workloads well and saying like, okay, this is what we want to get to. Here's a 4-week plan to ramp up slowly. That's a huge problem, right? So we don't know how many impacts that are taken, but also in gymnastics is that we don't know the different force numbers of certain areas someone's training on, right? So we don't know how hard the forces are on tumble track, versus rod strip versus a brand new spring floor versus an old spring floor versus different types of spring floors. We do have data generally on what these things are, but there's really no concrete summarized, approach to here's the jump in force between these 9 surfaces that we commonly train on: the trampoline, a tumble track, a rod floor, a new floor, a 5-year-old floor, right? We don't understand a sting mat, right? We don't really know what these different force progressions are. And so it's very challenging from a coaching point of view. I'm empathetic towards coaches here. It's challenging from a coaching point of view, and it's also challenging from a medical provider's point of view to say, okay, this is the force of trampoline in soft surfaces, so we're going to do this for a couple weeks. Then we know logically the next progression, I'm making this up because I don't know, might be, the rod floor with the sting mat, right? Intuitively as a coach, that's what makes sense to me, but I don't have hard data behind that, right? And then saying, okay, in preseason, we're going to ramp up. We're going to go from the rod floor to the spring floor with a sting mat, and then we're going to go 8-incher or a 12-incher, and then we're going to do this. We don't have a really good force progression to follow, so it's challenging to sometimes expose somebody properly over the course of 8 weeks to get ready for their first meet, okay? So this is a situation where you have really high forces, right? We have really high repetitions, and we sometimes have challenge in the amount of teaching that's going on with proper landing patterns. You can already start to see like, oh, this is getting a little bit, makes sense of why there's so many overuse knee injuries and why so many people may have a trouble negotiating these forces, causing injuries or overuse type stuff. So if you put those together, right, and then another just really, really obvious problem that we have in gymnastics is that there is still a large lack of evidence-based strength conditioning being used inside the gymnastics community. And I will openly say this, that any mistake I talk about that I have made full on, right? I used to go super old school, just do what my coach did, thousands of squat jumps, thousands of panel mat plyos because it was cardio, quote unquote. Like, I get it. I understand. I'm not off the hot plate here. And so when I say these things, it's coming from only a position of empathy and love and wanting to help the sport as much as I can. I'm not trying to bash coaches or medical providers or anybody because I have literally made all these mistakes. Okay. But in the last 10 years, particularly for me, I have been exposed and I've been lucky to be around some just absolutely phenomenal strength and conditioning coaches. And I've also had access to some phenomenal research to read about what's going on here. Okay. And when you look at what needs to happen in terms of like mitigating risk of knee injuries in particular, there is a large amount of data supporting the need to use external weight training and weightlifting and periodization, right? And cross training, right? And not only doing body weight based exercises year round to try to get someone's legs stronger to handle those forces, right? It's simply an equation. If you look at the physics of it, it's simply an equation of the tissue's capacity versus what the sport is doing to them over the course of a season or something like that. Okay, so there is amazing evidence here that we have, right? So Lohanssen in 2016, I believe, had a really great paper that was outlining all the things that we could do to mitigate risk and strengthening just general exercise and strength conditioning. A proper program properly done with the right exercises and coaching was one of the most substantial things that we could do to reduce risk. And this was shown for about 33%. Okay. There's other great research from Tim Hewitt in particular showing that a combination of strength training and then also proper landing patterns together can like dramatically reduce risk, like by up to 50% of ACL injuries and then possibly 66% in female injuries for non-contact ACLs. That is a massive amount of modifiable factors that we could do. Can you imagine a 50% reduction in possible ACL injuries by strength training and proper landing patterns? That's astronomical, right? We have to be entertaining this a little bit more. But there's also some other really great research out there from like the IOC and pediatric ACL injuries, but also there's some issues in patellar tendinopathy or some different loading strategies that show that strength and conditioning and exercise, the proper progression and dosage of exercise is massively, massively important. And I always kind of promote this as something I try to teach everybody when I teach courses or consult or travel. I'm always talking about strength and conditioning, but this is probably the most obvious example of something that could be really, really helpful, which is in the knee joint and particularly the ankle joint, anything in the leg, right? Because the lower body in all of gymnastics takes just a massive amount of force and a massive amount of stress. But for performance, it's also what you need to be powerful and get bigger skills. So we have this intersection of what could skyrocket performance and what could also reduce injury risk or mitigate risk. And it's really good evidence-based strength and conditioning principles that use a combination of gymnastics body weight essentials, but also weight training and weightlifting and dumbbells, kettlebells, barbells, all that kind of stuff. And I'll break down some of the challenges about working with strength coaches or getting someone involved. There are certain, approaches that are maybe not as beneficial, because you don't want to use a baseball program or a football program and just copy paste it on a gymnast. It's really going to be a disaster. But you have to be willing to work with a team and find out what's the best approach and how to map that over the year. All right. So I want to just point out here, as I mentioned on the performance point of view, that you have to try to understand that this is going to be a mutually beneficial thing for both performance and injury risk. Okay. So take a step back and look at what gymnastics is. Gymnastics is an explosive body weight sport, right? It's power based. We want to build explosive power for the athletes to do skills on floor, vault, trampoline, endurance for rhythmic, all that kind of stuff. Bigger jumps and leaps come from power in all domains. Men's gymnastics, bigger vaults, faster runs, tumbling passes, right? Better sticking landing potential, handling forces of really high level skills. That is what everybody wants. Everybody wants explosive power, and they want to be able to hit routines well, right? So when you look at, okay, how do we break down what goes into power? Power is a combination or a product of force times velocity, which some people also call impulse. But in the easiness of this is force and velocity is really how you get more explosive power. Okay. If you want to increase power, you can either increase the force delivered to the equipment or expressed, or you can reduce the time in which that is expressed. And that might increase your power output. All right. So with that being said, you look at, okay, well, how do I get more force? What can I do for more force? Obviously, one thing you can do is you can optimize your technique. If you understand how to be stiffer on the equipment, where your hand should go in a round off back handspring, where to set, where to look, that will increase your power, because you're not leaking energy, as they call it. You're holding on to energy, so more of it will be expressed in your skill. But that really does have a rate limiting factor. You can always get more perfect technique, right? But there's eventually going to be a cap of how well you're executing things. So what do you think about after that is, well, the other way to get strong, to increase force, is to increase a muscle strength, right? If you increase strength of a muscle, you can express more force at a top limit, right? So you want to be able to express more force, you have to get stronger. Okay. The way you get stronger, looking at research, is a combination of good evidence-based strength conditioning that has some body weight stuff built in, but also uses external load. External load and overload training, right, causes the muscle to be damaged in a positive way. Good stress occurs. The body responds to that by increasing, the muscle size is one part of it. It also increases the neural ability of the muscle to fire in a more synchronized way. So all the motor units can fire together. It's called disinhibition. So it's not only about just getting large, huge muscles. There's a way to program in a way that's more power focused, but you get very, very positive effects on increasing, the drive of motor units, they're called, right? Or synchronizing all of the muscles together in the lower body to work together to produce force and some sort of movement, right? That is one of the most supported evidence-based ways to get more force, is to get stronger by using weight training. Okay. So I'm not saying that someone should throw out all their body weight gymnastics stuff and only do strength training for the legs. I'm saying it's a combination of both, and it's a hybrid model, which is what I strongly promote and have kind of helped people understand, that based on the time of the year, you're going to want to use one or the other. Right. You also look at, how do you increase velocity over time? So how do you reduce the time in which it's expressed so more speed is given? Well, that is very clearly also supported in research to be done with a combination of good technique work, but also body weight drills, sprinting drills, jumping drills, but overload as well, right? Like by teaching a specific program that's periodized towards power, you can do more power-based exercises that kind of work on velocity. So jumps and bounding and hurdle hops and sprinting and all that kind of technical work as well. That comes to a good strength and conditioning program when it's paired with a great gymnastics specific strength program as well. So that is what the sport is about. So I'm just trying to really plead the case that if we want to get power out of the athletes, a hybrid model with external weightlifting is kind of a no-brainer. But again, it still has not been adopted in the culture because of stubbornness or lack of education or just unknown. People don't know how to approach that in a safe way. I totally understand that. Or strength coaches who maybe don't understand gymnastics. I get that too. But it's clearly that's going to be beneficial for power. And also, the injury equation, right? It's just force and capacity. The force experienced on the athlete's body is more than their capacity, and it causes breakdown over time. So whether that's slowly, repetitively over the course of a week or 2 months or whatever else it is, and their knee finally gets really, really sore, or unfortunately, it's a situation where they land and their knee and their quads and their hamstrings, their legs can't handle that force, and their knee moves into a really awkward position and it causes something to be damaged, an acute injury. That is still a situation of the capacity being under what the force delivered to the tissue is. If the capacity is not up to snuff with the force being delivered, you're going to have an issue pop up. Okay. And there's obviously performance issues where someone's hopping off beam, or they're not sticking their dismount, or they go out of bounds, or who knows. But both these things together, for knee injury risk reduction and also performance increasing, come down to really understanding good strength conditioning principles and using those, including weight training and body weight together. So lots of different, opportunities there, just to highlight some research that I think is really, really helpful for, ACL, meniscus, patellar tendinopathies, all that kind of stuff, patellofemoral pain, meniscus. So Nascimento, I'm sorry, I butchered that name, but in 2017 had a really good quote. It said that hip and knee strengthening is effective and superior to knee strengthening alone for decreasing pain and improving activity in persons with patellofemoral pain or knee pain. Okay, so showing us that a good comprehensive strength program for the hip and the knee together is more effective than just doing isolated knee exercises, which I see sometimes happening. That's not an example of a really good comprehensive program. Just doing knee extensions and stuff like that are not going to get you where you want to be on a sports performance point of view. Okay. And it doesn't always mean that the actual strength training you do will improve strength and cause your pain to go away. But for many conditions, it seems that loading is really, really beneficial for injuries as well. So I say this now because I think in a lot of rehab settings, we're scared to load somebody and to push them a little bit. But the research reflects that external weight training and doing some loading is going to be really, really helpful to help that athlete get back to sport. So if we have a situation where the culture doesn't use strength conditioning in a formal way as its preventative method or its regular sports performance training, and we have a situation where on a medical side of things, we're not loading enough, we don't understand those strength conditioning principles, we have a situation where someone is chronically underloaded and they're always getting their knee to be more flared up and more irritated, right? It pushes it outside of what Chris Powers calls is the envelope of function. So if the sport is pushing someone outside the knee joint's ability to handle it, outside their envelope of function, it's going to cause irritation, pain, maybe some injuries, some acute tissue damage. And it's going to be this chronic vicious cycle where someone constantly can't get out of that rehab position, and they're always limited because their knees are always bothering them. All right. So now let's kind of look a little bit more into some of the low-hanging fruit about what's really, really important. Something that I didn't mention in the ankle injury podcast that I really wanted to kind of go back and edit, but I'll mention it here, is I think in particularly in the NCAA, this is an issue where competition density comes up as a big factor we have to deal with, right? In club and the younger levels, we have people competing maybe once a month, twice a month. Maybe they don't do that many meets. They do 8 total throughout the course of the season. And in elite, it's even crazier how little sometimes you compete, right? Like 3 to 4 times, a season, and then championships maybe, or maybe some other qualifiers, but you really don't have that many meets. You're training much more because the skills are challenging. So in college forever, however, and this came up after talking with a lot of coaches and some medical providers that work with these college programs, one of the biggest challenges is going from a situation where maybe your whole life you weren't used to competing so much. And then you go to college and you have to be on the ball every week. And so you're competing, 12 to 14 weeks in a row. And that means you're doing routines much more often during the season, and you're getting much more exposure to harder landings, more than you ever might in your entire life. And so I've been thinking a lot about this lately. I think that some of the injuries we see, particularly in the last episode, we talked about, Achilles injuries, ruptures, or maybe ankle sprains or fractures, stuff like that, stress fractures, plantar fasciitis. And in the knee, we see this as well with like patellar tendinitis or quad tendinopathy or some overuse bone bruises or stress fractures. I think a huge part of this might be related to, unfortunately, that huge change we have where the preseason is not as long as we'd like it to be. Maybe the off-season training is not as optimal for strength conditioning and prep work. Then we go into the season and we get excited, and we have some people competing back to back to back to back weeks, and it really becomes problematic. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that was a very important factor related to knee injuries, particularly overuse injuries. That's really, really important for us to have a conversation about. But also, you have to start to factor in fatigue, global fatigue, and, recovery, and the timeline sometimes between meets are like 4 days, right? Like you sometimes compete on a Monday or a Saturday, and then you're doing it again on a Thursday or Friday. Like that's very, very quick turnaround. And sometimes maybe globally we can't recover, not to mention all the stress of being an athlete and going to class and your daily life. But physiologically, biophysiologically, we have to realize there's probably a challenging return on investment for recovery in terms of what you put in and how much you actually recover because of the time scale. But then also, we might have a lot of snowballing issues over the course of the year. So it's a tough conversation to have because it might involve some fundamental changes to the way we approach a structure of a season or a year. But I think it's something we have to have an honest conversation about to make sure that we're putting the athletes in the best position to succeed and stay healthy and not have these big devastating injuries. Okay. So moving on to the next factor that I think is really important is we have to be really honest in remembering that while college is primarily obviously 18 and older, that's probably only about like 300 to 350 people, right? The majority of people in gymnastics are kids. They are kids who are under the age of 16, and they are going through rapid growth changes. They are really struggling sometimes to be strong enough and powerful enough to handle some of these forces and these repetitive impacts. So we know that there are situations where 8, 10, 12-year-olds are doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of impacts per week as they try to learn skills, and they're competing and they're trying to do things that are fun. Like I understand how awesome the sport is, but having kids that young do skills that hard comes with a serious whiplash collateral damage sometimes, because the athletes have not only open growth plates of their knee and of their kneecap, but also they are not nearly as strong and powerful enough as they can be totally, right? And you look at Esteban Ballier's work, and you see that peak strength and peak power and peak cardiovascular capacity is definitely not from 10 to 14, right? It's when someone's older, they've gone through puberty, they've had the hormonal changes to get more strength, they've had proper growth and development to have proper dimensions to do some of the things that are really challenging. So we have this weird intersection in gymnastics where we're asking sometimes, pre-puberty athletes to do elite level skills or extremely demanding skills when they're maybe really not anywhere close to being ready to handle it mentally or physically or emotionally. So I don't say this to be, saying that nobody should do gymnastics when they're young. I think gymnastics is the best sport for kids to do when they're young, to be honest. I think it's phenomenal. And it's not to say that I think we should pump the brakes and just stop completely with doing what we're doing, but we have to have a really hard, honest conversation about what we expect of 8 to 12, in particular, 8 to 14-year-olds in terms of training, competition, levels, right? And it gets really tough here because you get into a gray water of trying to get to college and trying to get to a level that you want to compete at or doing a skill you want to do. I understand fully as a coach and as someone who works as a medical provider every day with these athletes, the challenges that this embarks on us. But we have a really tough situation where we have someone is pre-puberty, the growth plates are open, they're not strong enough, they don't have the cardiovascular capacity peak yet, and it intersects with the most challenging period of gymnastics jumping from level 6 to 7 to 8 to 9. They start rapidly increasing the training hours they do per week, and they start rapidly increasing how much they're doing these skills. It's a situation that's really challenging. And so what's the solution here in a, not to spoil the later part of the episode, but it's a really hard conversation about education and about what do we do as coaches to make sure we can train these skills and develop these athletes for their high level goals they want to do, but not burn them out by pushing them too fast, too quickly when they're having a lot of issues pop up with, knee injuries that are growth plate injuries that sideline them for a year or two. Like, how can we use the equipment, the surfaces, restructure the season, have better rules and regulations around ages that people train at and how many hours they train per week, guidelines for these things. We need better education around these topics so that people feel comfortable, not doing something that's against the grain, or, they're not training 30 hours a week, that they're missing their shot, or so to speak, right? That stuff's kind of crazy. And I think what next comes up with this conversation is another realistic, harsh reality about why knee injuries and ankle injuries and many other things are happening is the sport culture itself still has a long way to go for many different areas of making sure that we have environments that are the safest for athletes long term. Okay. So I talked about this in the last episode, but early specialization and year-round training are massive problems in gymnastics still. There is an abundance of research showing and suggesting, from the IOC consensus statement to the position statements from the NSCA to some great work by Myers and all in part 1, part 2 of Specialization from like 2018, I believe it was, that really outline how risky it is to not only do a single sport from a young age, but also to train in that sport year round. So if you start doing only gymnastics from the age of 6, or the age of 8 was the median age in a study that I helped put on, right? Think about what happens when you only do one sport from a young age. Not only do you open yourself up to much more repetitive overuse injuries because you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, you're also setting somebody up to get burnt out, right? Because you get bored or you get exhausted with what you're doing. Okay. So you're also probably setting somebody up to really not have the maximal potential that they can reach as an athlete, right? My buddy Dan Lonsdale has this great quote about being the wider the base, the higher the peak. If someone starts only doing gymnastics from 6 to 8 years old and they do nothing else athletically, you're really narrowing their tunnel of how low that, how narrow that base can be, excuse me, and it limits them the overall peak, right? I think what should be happening more so is I do believe there will be earlier specialization than average, which the average is 14 to 15 in other sports, or maybe even 16. That being said, if you don't go at the right time in gymnastics, you will possibly miss out on opportunities. So I'm not saying someone should wait till they're 15, 16, 17 to only do gymnastics. What I'm saying is that the average age we do it at should be promoted later. I feel as though most gymnasts, if not all gymnasts, should be trying to do multiple sports and try different things and have other activities till the age of 10 or so. Then if they have really, really high level goals, maybe they can start funneling more into that. If their goals aren't super high level, I don't think they need to be, at 10, maybe a little bit later. But I think that not only encourages them to have the best chance of success with not getting burnt out or having overuse injuries, but it also will allow them to, experience the sport for longer and not have so many concerns for athletic development being undermined, right? The other piece that goes along with this is going to be year-round training, right? There's an abundance of evidence that says doing a single sport year-round is problematic for overuse injury risk, right? It goes up substantially, and burnout goes up substantially as well. And you have situations still in gymnastics where someone might take a week off here or a couple of days off here, but some athletes wouldn't take more than 2 days off because it's, quote, bad for them, which is crazy, right? It's absolutely crazy. And I think what happens is you have someone who just constantly gets beat down over the course of a competitive season. They take a few days off or a weekday off and they come back, start working new skills right away, and they go hard on summer all year long, right? And we never really have a relative off season or cross training happening. So someone can never fully recover from their injuries, but also they're just constantly mentally exhausted, right? And so I think the COVID pandemic showed us that a lot of athletes, when they had that kind of forced rest, they came back and they felt the best physically and mentally they have ever felt. And I talked to a lot of gym clubs and national team members and college athletes and coaches as well, saying that when they approached that return safely and slowly, once they got the rust out after a couple of weeks, they felt phenomenal. And I think that's something we should really take to heart. I don't think that 4 to 5 months like we had in some cases is ideal. I think that's too long. I think, unfortunately, that makes it really challenging, particularly because nobody could cross train or do what they wanted to do. But having, I think, like a pretty hard 2 weeks off and then 2 weeks of a slow ramp up and then another even month of just getting all your basics in and stuff, I think having a relative off season of 4 to 6 weeks would not only maintain the fun and the joy and the excitement, you wouldn't be so burnt out. It also would substantially help reduce some of these nagging overuse injuries, because you could use that time to rest, get your movement evaluations, get your rehab done, get your maintenance care stuff, get your strength and conditioning program in order, start doing some cross training, do your basics, your drills, get back in there slowly. It would be phenomenal. I think if we, unfortunately, in the sport, everyone is scared of doing that because they're like, oh my God, what's going to happen if I don't do that? Right. And I think we had a forced experiment, which we should take to heart, which is learning that these relative off seasons and cross training programs are one of the best things that we can do for performance, but also longevity wise, they're incredibly helpful. So I really, really hope that we start having more honest conversations around year-round training, early specialization, and having coaches and medical providers and strength coaches get together and have talks about what's best and giving recommendations for people to follow, consensus statements, which is what we have in many other sports and many other areas of the professional world of medical care. That's super, super important. And I can't not just dodge the bullet and say that, like, there's just the harsh reality is that we still have some gyms in some places, not everywhere, that are just relentless on the kids at a young age that are doing. I know of gyms that are training 20 to 25 hours per week with 8 to 10-year-olds just because they're trying to get more and more and more and more and more. Like, that's insane. That's absolutely insane what you're doing to an athlete. Like, there's a way to go about it. I know this for a fact because my friends work with elite level athletes at that age. There's a way to get all your training hours and make progress productively without being in there 25 hours per week when you're that young. That's crazy, right? You're undermining someone's childhood, and you're also probably causing more harm than good. So I think that needs to happen too, whereas we need to put a pretty hard, firm guideline on not allowing that to happen. I don't know how that happens, but we have to be much more stern as a peer pressured culture to make sure that everybody is not doing something just because they're scared they're going to miss out, and they're not pushing their kids too hard too soon when they're little, because what happens when you're 10 to 14 largely rolls over into have huge issues in 16, 18 in college and elite and beyond. If we are more respectful of those younger years and we use cross training, we understand the methods to do proper periodization, and we monitor workloads, we have great communication and trust. A lot of these issues that are snowball problems that are really, really problematic can maybe be reduced a little bit. I have situations where on a medical provider point of view, I work with some high level athletes that are chasing level 10 in a scholarship. They've cumulatively missed 2.5 years of training because of their injuries, knee injuries, back injury, wrist hurt, this. Imagine what would happen if you had 2.5 years back. I'm talking about not like kind of still working, like they missed 6 weeks because they hurt their knee, and then 8 weeks because they hurt their back. They come back and then their ankle gets sore, right? And this is just the nature of the beast in gymnastics, trying to go back into a hard competition season. But man, 2 years is crazy. There's so many athletes that are just missing so much time and missing out on so much potential training because they're constantly having, knee, ankle, back injuries. So I think it's important to mention. I know it's not exhaustive, but I think that's really important. And the last thing I want to mention before we talk about some basics here is we also really need much better education about proper technique, using technique, phenomenal foundational basics, and training these skills in a way that's really technically sound so that we're protecting the athletes as much as possible, but we're also not skipping steps and setting somebody up for disaster down the road. So this comes to two parts. One is that we need to overhaul the educational system and make sure that people have great academic knowledge from high-level experts in the coaching and medical point of view and strength and conditioning. We also need to make sure there's mentorship where you can go and learn these things and watch these things. It can't be just academic. I think we need the medical model to be applied here, which is half academic, half mentorship. You do that for a year, take a test, do your credentialing. Then if you want to work in high level gymnastics, another year, whatever else it should be. But I see that as the only way out to make these things change and stick long term. But that's a big part of it. The other part of it, I think it's really important, is we need to make sure that we're not just chucking skills. We're not just like going for it and throwing the soup because we want to do it, right? We have to really be firm about not letting people do risky things just because they want the score, they want the Facebook post, the Instagram post, they want to go on TikTok viral, whatever else it should be. That's not a great way to live. So the education for skill technique is crucial, but then mentorship and applying that is also really, really important as well, right? If we have the right education, we also have a culture that supports healthy progressions and safety. That's how you have somebody really learning the best possible things and reaching their maximal potential, because great basics, great foundational work, and the art of coaching, of getting through that boring stuff and getting through that stuff that's challenging, that will set somebody up for the most success down the road when they want to go, say they just want to do gymnastics for the rest of their life and recreationally never compete a day in their life, do adult gymnastics. I think that's amazing. They're going to have the most potential to do that long-term for the most years. And if they want to go to the Olympics, obviously potential goes up when you have great basics, great technique, and you're letting things go through the proper steps. All right. So that is a large background here and kind of the factors. What I want to do now is I want to go through just a very basic overview of some of the anatomy, and then we'll talk about specific injuries themselves. This section on anatomy people really enjoyed last time because I tried to make it a little bit more middle of the road. We're not going to go and have a dissertation here. Literally this, the content in this section could be an entire year-long course, and it's someone's profession for the entire life. So it's impossible for us to, really break this down a lot, but we have to understand the basic anatomy if we have to understand the common injuries, which then influences the rehab and the prevention of what we can do, or the mitigation of risk. Okay. So when you look at the knee joint, I like to always think about things in layers in terms of the deepest layer and working your way out. So the first layer is going to be the bones, right? Which is also called the osseous layer. Okay. So the knee joint itself is kind of two joints. The thigh bone, which is called your femur, kind of comes down from your hip, and it makes essentially like a little bit of a double circle down like this. And if you can see this, you can see my hand is downward with my knuckles kind of making the top of the joint. That's your thigh bone, right? On the bottom part of that, you have another set of your thigh bone, right? So your lower shin bone, which is your tibia. So your femur comes down and it meets on top to meet your tibia, which is on the bottom, right? So on the top here, you have these things called condyles, which are large portions of circular notches that have cartilage on them. And that kind of meets on top of what is the lower bone, the shin bone, which is the tibia. So the bottom part that it meets with is called the tibial plateau, right? And we'll go into it, but there's the meniscus sit on top of that as cushions and shock absorbers. But that's the main knee joint itself. The tibiofemoral joint is those two things coming together. Tibiofemoral, tibia, femur, tibiofemoral, right? So you have that on top, right? And that's kind of the main weight-bearing structure of the knee, right? You have the cartilage on the bottom of the femur and also the meniscus together that help buffer those really, really high forces that come together. That's the main joint on top, okay? Now, sitting on top of that in the front, you have what's called a circular bone or a sesamoid bone called your patella. So your patella, right, sits on top of these two bones, and think about it like a train on a train track. As the train moves up and down, right, it helps the track itself be more smooth. So as your knee joint bends, the kneecap moving in different directions is what allows proper gliding and proper shock absorption and motion. So you have those two bones together, and then your kneecap sitting on top of that little intersection behind it is called the next point, the patellofemoral joint, right? So the patella next to the femur, patellofemoral joint, right? So tibiofemoral is those two bottom bones. Patellofemoral is that sesamoid circular bone, your kneecap sitting on top and moving up and down side to side. Okay. And so you look at those things, and it's important to remember because not only does the knee bending, the type of knee bending that occurs, allow high forces to be put through them, but also the kneecap itself with the muscles that are around it allow the knee to move smoothly and handle some of the forces of jumping and landing and sprinting. So there's a lot of different things that can kind of happen with the bones themselves because of the way this is set up, right? The joint is very much made for bending, right? It's what we call a hinge joint, right? So it's not really made for twisting, and it's not really going to tolerate a lot of side to side motion, unlike your ankle, which has a lot of structure to go up and down, side to side, and rotate and twist, or your shoulder, which has a ton of motion. The knee joint is mainly a bending motion joint. It does have some twisting to allow for certain things to happen, but it doesn't love high twisting forces, and it doesn't love high side to side forces, right? It's really made for primarily front to back bending. So like I said, I think the analogy that we really like here is the train on the track. So if someone's sitting, right, the train is like this, right? The track would be those two bones, the femur and the tibia. The train itself is on top of the train track, right? And so the train moves up and down as the knee joint bends. But the odd thing about the knee joint is that a lot of research used to think that the train itself was moving side to side, or it was moving in a weird position. It was tracking wrong, maltracking. And that sometimes happens. But for the most part, what we've learned from research from Chris Powers and many other people who studied dynamically what's happening in the knee joint is it's not only about the train itself that can move up and down side to side, the tracks themselves can twist a little bit, right? And so what I mean by that is that the top bone, the femur, right, that can twist if the hip joint is not maybe doing its job, right? If the hip joint is either not strong enough and it's letting the knee cave in, or if it's not strong enough and it's not absorbing force as well, the train itself twisting can obviously bug the train track itself twisting can bug the train, right, on the underside, right? Also, the bottom portion of the track, right, which would be your shin bone, that track can twist as well, which is related to the ankle joint. So if the ankle joint is very stiff, if the foot is not strong enough, if the calf muscles are not strong enough, that can also cause that train track to twist a little bit, and that can create some issues happening, right? So I think that's really important to understand because jumping and landing, although the knee joint is really, really important, we want to strengthen the joint. We want to make sure it's feeling good, it's moving well. We also have to look at the hip and the ankle alongside the knee joint at all times, right? This is like the kinetic chain. I'm jumping ahead, but I think in that analogy of the train track is really important to hold in your mind as we move through these different layers, because the train track and the joint itself is not very stable. We need things around that to help solidify things, ligaments and muscles, to control that not twisting motion happening at the knee, or that like hyperextension not happening at the train track, because that would obviously damage it. You could also have issues where, because of maybe flexibility issues or strength issues and balances, you can have a situation where the train itself, unfortunately, is getting pushed down into the track a little bit harder than it's used to. And that excessive pressure down on the train track can cause some irritation of the wheels of the train cannot move as well. Some friction can cause some damage over time. So the analogy here is that sometimes factors above and below the knee can cause issues at the knee we have to deal with, but also factors locally at the knee related to strength or flexibility or issues like that swelling inside the knee joint can negatively impact the way that the knee joint moves and thus cause some irritation or some pain. All right. So that's kind of the first layer is the bones. The second layer, which a lot of people are going to be familiar with these terms, is going to be the ligaments of the knee, right? Or also what's called the joint capsule of the knee. So ligaments and capsules together, kind of work together. Tendons are a little bit more in the muscular department. But the first layer to think about is that kind of on the knee joint itself, wrapped around those two big bones, the tibial femoral joint coming together, wrapped around the knee and the patella itself is what's called the synovial fluid joint capsule, right? So the joint capsule, I like to picture as kind of like thick saran wrap that wraps around the knee joint, right? And it kind of maintains a nice closed system. And inside of that is what's called synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is there to not only provide nutrition to the joint, right? It also provides quite a bit of lubrication so that the knee joint can move nice and smooth, right? If there's not a lot of lubrication, it's not very, hydrated with this constantly, it can become stiff and irritating, right? That being said, one of the biggest causes of problems in the knee joint when you have an injury is swelling, right? There's a lot of synovial fluid or blood that can accumulate inside the joint, and it can push out and make that balloon, that saran wrap, really be tight and pressurous. And that can cause a lot of achiness. It can cause some irritation of some structures around the knee. It can make it not move very well. It can change the flexibility. So there's some really good research that shows that the more swelling you have, not only is that problematic maybe for pain, it also might turn down the muscles activation around the knee joint, right? So injecting with saline or just fluid that's not, a medicine, just injecting 30 cc's of fluid can cause some swelling of the joint. It can cause the quad muscle to not work as well. Same thing, we've seen that in the hip, right? So it's important to remember that the joint capsule is really, really important, and it's really, really crucial for health of the knee, but also it can become irritated or there can be so much swelling, it causes issues around the knee joint. So that's one of our mainstays in injuries, is trying to reduce the swelling and manage the swelling so that the knee joint can move and glide. The train track has a nice smooth motion between it, right? Sometimes the actual joint capsule itself can be irritated or have some issues in it, or some like a plica, for example, is a fold in the capsule that can become painful and inflamed. That can happen itself, but I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that surrounding that joint is that joint capsule. All right. As we move into the ligaments of the knee, there are many, many small ligaments of the knee that have little jobs here and there. But I just want to highlight the big ones, which I think people are going to kind of be familiar with, just to kind of frame up the conversation. So one is obviously going to be the ACL. The anterior cruciate ligament is probably the most famous one. And what that is it's essentially a band of ligament that goes from the top bone, the femur, down to the front of the knee bone on the bottom, called the tibia, right? The tibial plateau. So this angle band goes down across, and what happens is it prevents the excessive anterior or forward motion of the shin, but it also helps prevent some rotational stress. And this can also be stressed when the knee hyperextends quite a bit. So it prevents this kind of pivoting and twisting motion of the knee. But then you have a concomitant ligament, which is paired with it, which is the PCL, which is the posterior cruciate ligament. So that goes from the opposite X-fat pattern of going from the back of the top knee bone down to top of the front knee bone back to the back. So that is the opposite. It prevents translation backwards of the knee. So say if somebody lands in an awkward position, their knee goes really far backwards, they can damage the PCL as well. But it also helps with the rotational stresses. The ACL is set up typically more to take some irritation or some problems, so you hear about it much more often. But PCL injuries happen too, and those are inside the joint. They're from the top to the bottom of those two bones. So they're within inside the joint capsule. They're inside the joint, right? Versus the MCL and the LCL, which stands for the medial collateral ligament, is on the inside of the knee, bridging the inside of the knee to the lower shin bone, right? And then the LCL is on the outside of the knee. The lateral collateral ligament goes from the outside of the knee joint to the bottom part of the shin. So those kind of prevent side to side motion, right? So your MCL prevents a lot of gapping inwards. So say if your knee moves inwards and it stretches that joint open like this, that can stress the MCL, versus if you land with your knee buckling to the outside, that sideways bending motion can stress the LCL. So you hear about most often is injuries to the ACL and the MCL, because those dynamic kind of pivoting and knee caving motions happen quite often, unfortunately, sometimes. So you can stress the MCL, you can stress the ACL, you can stress the joint capsule itself or some of the tissues around that. Okay. So those are the main ones, the main four collateral ligaments: ACL, PCL, MCL, LCL. Okay. Important to keep in mind that the MCL and the LCL, because they're outside the joint, they have more blood flow and they can typically heal a little bit better. So if somebody does have a grade 1 or 2 MCL strain, sometimes they will let that just heal and scar down on its own, versus if somebody tears their ACL or has an injury there, typically it's not going to heal on its own. It needs correction to deal with because of the high stress forces that go there and not having a lot of blood flow to that area. So just wanted to point that out a little bit. Okay. There are many other important ligaments of the knee that I didn't want to go super in depth in because sometimes it's confusing. But one that I do want to point out is called the MPFL. So this is a ligament that sits from the kneecap and attaches the kneecap to the inside of the shin bone. So if you think about that kneecap, that train track sitting on top, this ligament goes from the inside portion of the kneecap, attaches to the outside portion, the inside portion of the knee, and it prevents the train from going off the tracks to the side. So it prevents that train from going excessively outside the knee and dislocating, right? So the MPFL is really important to help stabilize some of that side-to-side motion of the knee, which again, when somebody lands sometimes, if they land and their knees cave in or it pivots, that train is moving outside laterally relative to that top train track moving inward, right? So Chris Powers' research showed us that we used to think that maybe it was like that the kneecap was moving off to the side, it was tracking poorly. What we sometimes see now is that it's actually more about the top shin bone, or the top bone, the femur twisting, and that as a result causes some sideways movement of the kneecap. And so that's important though, because sometimes people will have really hypermobility, they'll have some hyperflexibility of their joint capsules and their knee joint, and that knee will not track well, or the train that the train isn't sitting in a deep track that allows it to stay inside of those two lanes, and it's really shallow and it can sometimes move outside and dislocate someone's kneecap. So the MPFL is important because sometimes it's involved in someone who subluxes their knee or dislocates their knee or something like that. All right. So then moving on from there, we're going to have essentially the cartilage, right? So the cartilage itself, like I mentioned, is going to be something that helps buffer forces, and it's something that helps to control some of those really, really high impacts that happen over time. When we have someone who is experiencing cartilage issues, someone who is experiencing some irritation of the cartilage, oftentimes what this is repetitive impact of the bone, right? It's repetitive impact top down a little bit, and that's going to be an issue. So there's two things that are really important here when you talk about, it's considered, I guess, I put it kind of in the ligament or the bone category together, but it lines the bone on the top of the femur. So when you look at this, right, someone's on top like this, like I said, you have cartilage that's on the bottom part of the femur, the condyles themselves. Cartilage is just an extra way to buffer some of those forces not going through the bone. So really big portions of cartilage on the top and on the bottom are there, and they intersect with the meniscus on the bottom, right? There's not as much cartilage showing on the bottom point because you have these big shock absorbers, these meniscus. But the point I want to make is that while this cartilage is really important on the bottom of the knee, at the top of the knee joint here, you also have cartilage on the underside of the kneecap, so the back of the kneecap that touches with those two other train tracks, right? And so think about the train track itself having some cartilage on the top, but also the bottom portion of the train, the wheels, for example, have some built-in buffer, some rubber that help to kind of maintain some of the force not going through it. So there's cartilage in the backside of the kneecap that's really important to help provide a nice smooth gliding of the train up and down. So you can have cartilage issues that happen on the actual knee joint itself or the back of the kneecap related to, again, forces going through the different portions when the knee caves or twists, or when somebody hits a really hard landing. Sometimes you can have a cartilage shearing injury where that occurs. But it's important to mention that cartilage because it's very, very important, because as the knee bends more, there's a different interaction between how much of that cartilage is available to buffer those forces. So at the first 20 degrees of knee bending, that really initial knee bending and a little bit farther, the bottom tip of the patella, the kneecap, is starting to make contact with the knee joint itself and that cartilage. And so what happens there is that you have a little bit of cartilage taking a lot of force. There's not a lot of surface area to buffer that. So a lot of people have knee pain and have knee injuries with either their patellar tendon or the backside of their kneecap. It's like a little bit sore because they're landing maybe in a not proper way that doesn't allow bending of their knee to fully occur. They're landing very stiff and very rigid, back to that concern with old school landing techniques. What's happening is you might be putting a lot of stress on the kneecap, the patellar tendon, and some of those cartilage pieces that are just getting the same exact thing over and over and over again, instead of bending your knees fully and letting your muscles and other areas of the kneecap help out. As you bend your knee more, there's more contact between the backside of the kneecap and the train tracks, the trochlear groove it's called. There's more cartilage available and more surface area available to buffer those forces. So by bending your knee more, you get more surface contact between the back of the kneecap and also the knee joint itself. And also more muscles are involved to help out the quad, the hamstring, the glutes, the calves. So allowing someone to bend fully allows more surface contact of the knee joint and can help spread those forces out across multiple areas, not just put it on one spot on the cartilage or one area of the knee. Right. And then as you get very, very deep knee bending, there's a lot of contact engagement of the back of the kneecap on the actual knee joint itself. But also there's many, many different muscles that are involved, particularly down to 90, that allow the area to be deloaded a little bit. So it's not what we call like a knee dominant landing strategy. It's more of a hip or a combined landing strategy. So just kind of bringing that full circle around why it's so important, because there's research showing that really stiff, really rigid landing positions are concerning for the risk of an ACL injury or stress, possibly a pivoting and meniscus twisting forces, but also the patellar tendon and the kneecap itself takes quite a substantial amount more stress if we're landing in a very stiff, very rigid, non-knee bending pattern. Okay. So from there, let's move on and talk about the meniscus. Essentially, if you look to the top down on the knee joint, so if I took this knee joint like this, I pulled it like this, and I looking down on the tibia, the top of the tibial plateau, you would see a meniscus on the inside and the outside, which essentially is just like fibrocartilage. The ACL would insert between those, the PCL between those in the back. But essentially, it's a shock absorber. It's a giant buffer, right? It's a really great thing we have that's designed by evolution to help handle some of these stresses that go through the knee joint when we walk, when we jump, when we run, all that kind of stuff. So it's fibrocartilage, and it's kind of in two circles. One's a little bit more of a C shape, one's a little bit less of a C shape and more oblong. Right. But essentially, your medial and lateral meniscus are essentially just extra things to help handle these forces. Right. And I don't want to go into a super in-depth explanation of meniscus issues, so we'll talk about injuries in a little bit. But essentially, these are crucial shock absorbers that help to protect the cartilage, but they also help to buffer those forces. So we really want to make sure that the meniscus stays healthy, that it stays, it's not getting a ton of rotational compression and shearing forces, because that's going to cause some crankiness. But these types of what they call hoop stress go around and spread out some of these really high forces as we have more contact area of these joints to go through along with the cartilage. It can help optimally dissipate some of these forces across the knee when we run, when we jump, when we land. And if we have optimal dispersion of all these forces at the knee joint, but we also have other joints like the ankle and the hip and the core helping out and muscles helping out, that's how we mitigate the risk of something serious going on like that. Okay. So I think the other point I want to make is that there's different zones, they called, of the meniscus. So the inside, the middle, and the outside portions. What happens is that sometimes there's certain portions of those meniscus, again, looking top down, the inside, right, to the outside. There are some areas that have quite a bit more blood flow, and there's some areas that don't have quite a bit more blood flow, right? So the outer portions, the really far out portions that are closer to the joint capsule, closer to the blood flow and the vessels, they have more blood flow. They're called red zones. So they're typically able to heal a little bit better, right? They have more blood flow. Sometimes they won't deal with issues there because they're getting nutrition, they're getting some blood flow. However, as you move closer into the middle portion called the red-white zone is getting not as much blood flow, and the inner portion all the way towards the inside of the knee joint, the white zone, really doesn't have much blood flow at all. So if you have tears that are more, say, progressive in nature, degenerative, maybe they're on the outer portion, they're smaller, they might not do aggressive surgery methods right away. Versus if somebody lands and hyperextends their knee or pivots into a cave and it causes a dramatic sudden tear of the inside of the white portion, that's typically something they want to deal with because it's going to be challenging for that to heal on its own. And if the actual meniscus starts to flap upward into the joint or get caught, that's when you feel some clicking or some catching or some sudden kind of take your breath away moments, because that's caught inside the joint and it's changing the kinematics of the knee joint. So sometimes meniscus tears are small and they're in the red zone. They won't deal with them right away. Sometimes meniscus tears are more severe, more sudden, and they will want to deal with them right away with surgery, because if you leave them alone, they can start to progress more, get bigger, and then the cartilage can start to get irritated underneath it. But that's really the only thing that I wanted to mention, is that it's a shock absorber. It helps buffer those forces that go through the knee joint. And it's really not great to have a high compression and rotation or shearing forces, but also not like hyperextension or hyper bending of the knee, because that can stress the meniscus as well. All right. So that's kind of layer 2, is the ligaments, the meniscus, the cartilage all kind of mixed together there. The third layer is going to be muscular. So a lot of people are aware of this. They're aware of the muscles, the muscles that surround the knee joint. It's interesting to remember that there are no direct knee muscles, right? There's no muscles that start at the knee and end at the knee, really. There's a couple like the popliteus and some others, but mainly like in the ankle, for example, like you have peroneals and the calf and stuff that are really ankle muscles, right? But in the knee, it's a product of the thigh muscles and the hip muscles together with the lower shin bones as well. So on the front, the most obvious muscle that most people know is the quadriceps, right? Which is 4 smaller muscles that come together, right? So you have 3 of those 4 muscles are on the thigh bone themselves, and they kind of go down, they form into the patellar tendon or the quad tendon, which then goes over the kneecap and becomes the patellar tendon inserting on the bottom shin part, right? The higher shin bone. You have another one of those muscles, the 4th one, that actually starts up at your hip flexor area on your pelvis, combines with those 3 other muscles, and then seams in to become the quad. So those 4 muscles together, they not only help to straighten the knee, but they also lift the hip up a little bit. They do both together. Okay. So that's the front of the knee. Those 4 giant muscles going down, they create a quad tendon that's above the kneecap, go over the kneecap, and they insert into a patellar tendon that's on the lower shin bone, kind of where you hear about people getting Osgood Schlatters, which we'll talk about. That's the front of the knee. Okay. The back of the knee, you have the hamstrings themselves, which start from your butt bone, that sitting bone. You can feel that pointy bone. That's where the hamstrings start. The tendon is right there, the proximal hamstring tendon. And then you have these 3 very large muscles, right? The semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris. They go down the back of your leg, and they all have their own kind of insertion points below the knee near the bottom of the shin. So it's interesting, right? They start from the hip, go down the entire thigh, but they attach below the knee joint on the back of the calf area, the shin area. So these very large muscles that bend the knee, right? They bend the knee, but they also push the hip open and extend the hips. The quad muscles can straighten the knee and help flex the hip. The hamstring muscles can help bend the knee and then also help extend the hip backwards. Okay, so that's the front, that's the back. On the inside, you have a lot of adductor or groin muscles that are going from the pelvis and attaching down below the knee or above the knee. Various ones called like the adductor longus, the adductor magnus, the gracilis. We'll talk a lot about in the hip joint section. We talk about groin strains and stuff. But essentially, those can pull the legs together, but they can also influence the knee moving inside and outside, right? If the adductors are firing a lot or they're extremely stiff, sometimes that can change the knee moving inward, which puts more stress on the knee joint as well. All right. On the outside of the knee joint and the thigh, you have the quad muscle itself connecting with the hamstring through what's called the iliotibial band. Okay. So this iliotibial band is a large, dense connective tissue that kind of starts from the top of the hip joint and your TFL and your outer hip. Broad, flat structure that's connective tissue, goes all the way down and inserts on the outside of the knee. It gets a bad rap because people think you got to foam roll the crap out of it. But the reality is that the tightness of the TFL and the tightness of your glutes and your quads and hamstrings compress and dictate the tension that's through the IT band. So sometimes people have nerve irritation in the outside of their knee, their saphenous nerve, and they'll think it's coming from their IT band, and they'll absolutely crush themselves, right? And there's been some newer cadaver research that shows that cutting the IT band or the TFL and stuff doesn't always make a huge change in flexibility. So maybe more what we need is attention to the soft tissue, the quad, the hamstrings, proper stretching, eccentric loading, and just workload modification more so than just crushing ourselves on a foam roller. Okay, so that's kind of on the outside of the hip as well. Those are the 4 main ones: front, back, side to side. Okay, and then we also have the strength of the hip muscles are going to make a big influence. Again, rotating that femur joint, that hip joint rotating in and out is really largely coming from the hip muscles themselves. So the strength of the outside glute muscles, the hip muscles are really, really important to help maintain a good alignment of the knee so it's not moving in or out too much, but also to help buffer those forces. And below the knee joint, the calf muscles, the soleus and the gastroc are also really, really important for helping, to stabilize the knee a little bit and absorb some of those forces. So I outlined all these muscles and things like that, but a lot of these are influencing around the knee joint. They're not directly inside the knee joint, right? You will have some issues sometimes where someone has some IT band issues that might cause some changes in the way the kneecap moves. The quad being stiff, the calf being stiff can maybe put more compression on the patella. The patellar tendon itself can get irritated if we're not landing in a great way. We have a fat pad that's underneath the patellar tendon that also is sometimes really irritated as well. That also needs some time looking at. But it's also just important to remember about how much of this is really going on to the actual structures around the knee and not the actual, knee joint itself having its own muscles to protect itself again. So it's why it's just so important to remember about how to train this holistically, right? We want local knee strength, local knee issues to deal with, but we also want to make sure we're addressing everything above and below to influence how that knee joint is bending or moving or twisting. All right. And then these last 2 things we'll go through quickly before we talk about common injuries, right? So the neural layer is just going to be the next layer out, which essentially is just the nerves that are around the blood flow that's around the area. And there are some issues for sure with like the outside saphenous nerve that can get irritated, or sometimes in hyperextension injuries, the tibial nerve in the back can become irritated because it gets stretched out really fast. And that's really important to keep an eye on. But I don't want to go super in depth with all these things because it's kind of boring, and I'll bring them up as they go related to the injuries themselves. But just keep in mind that the knee joint itself has a lot of nerves around it, which is going to obviously cause some irritation or some problems around it. And a lot of the structures, is a crazy study by Scott Dye where he actually probed his own knee without anesthesia and tried to figure out what the most painful structures were, which of his knee, which is psychotic, but extremely helpful. But they found that things like the fat pad that was kind of wedged underneath the kneecap, or some of these structures outside, like the meniscus and stuff, were highly sensitive. And that comes from so much nerves being inside and around that area. So when you try to figure out what someone's having knee pain with, the joint capsule, the fat pad, the patellar tendon, you got to kind of probe a little bit and pick apart what might be referring their pain, and if that matches the anatomy behind it. Okay. The last thing I do want to just mention again, because it's so important, that last layer we talked about is going to be the kinetic chain. So this is going to be issues above or below that influence the knee joint. And we've talked extensively about how the hip joint, right? The hip itself can be twisting. The femur bone itself can twist the track and cause some irritation to the back of the kneecap. It can also cause the knee to cave in or out. If it's not strong enough, it has some stiffness. So the hip joint and the core as well, the pelvis, is very, very important to understand how that influences the knee joint. So we always have to be looking at the hip joint, training the hip joint, training the core when we talk about knee issues, but also the ankle joint itself, right? The ankle being very stiff, the ankle not having strength in the calf or the foot to support the arch and cause the knee to not cave in or hyperextend. Those things are also really, really important to look at alongside just the knee joint. So we always have to be thinking about the kinetic chain as well, assessing both things above and below, and strength training or doing interventions above and below to help out with that. All right. So that was the first kind of big chunk here. And in the second part of this, I want to go into specific injuries. I want to talk about what these injuries are briefly and what causes them, and then go through the rehabilitation process of what might be important to think about to help somebody with knee injuries who has problems going on. So the first one I want to come back to is going to be what I started the podcast on, which is this unfortunate kind of junk term, which is patellofemoral joint pain, right? Or just like PFJ, global knee pain, they call it sometimes. Again, this is a really generalized junk term that says you have knee pain. Shocking, right? It doesn't tell you what's going on or why you have knee pain. And so there's some really good papers that came out in the 90s and early 2000s. Kevin Wilk and George Davies, like I said, my boss, Mike Reinhold, was a part of this as well, which is really about going deeper and understanding what these different types of subsets of patellofemoral pain are, because that's going to influence diagnosis and treatment, right? So there are different kind of main categories of patellofemoral pain that we want to think about in terms of how the kneecap is moving or what's going on. That's going to really change a lot of what we do. Okay, so there's a lot of things that we'd have to look at with a subjective history and asking how they have pain or what's going on, but also our tests are going to sometimes dictate what's going on here. So the first big one that I think was famous and kind of popularized would be what's called excessive lateral compression syndrome, right? So, or lateral compression or pressure syndrome. So ELPS is what it's called, right? ELPS. And what is going on is kind of your more classic situation of outer knee pain, of outer kneecap pain on the outside, right? So in this situation, what's happening is that either because the knee, the top shin bone, the top femur bone is twisting inside, or the kneecap is getting pulled outside just a little bit because of stiffness, there's more pressure on the outside of the knee joint and more stretching on the inside of the knee joint, right? So when it twists like that, it moves the kneecap to the side a little bit. And you can have pain because the femur bone is hitting the back of the kneecap as somebody runs or jumps or lands, or because you're stretching out the inside a little bit and you're causing some irritation and compression on the outside. So that's one subset where you would look at soft tissue flexibility of the quad. If the IT band is causing some issues, you'd want to see someone's jumping and landing patterns to make sure that knee is not twisting. We'd want to be looking at ankle flexibility. We want to be looking at hip strength to make sure there's not any excessive rotation going on that way, right? That would be one category of knee pain that would have pain on the outside of the knee joint, maybe when someone's jumping or running or landing. A different type of situation might be a similar phenomenon, but the pain is now on the inside of the knee cap, which is called medial gapping, right? So again, what's happening is when you twist like that, or when someone's knee is buckling or going inward, you can be stretching out the joint capsule and the MCL and some of the capsular tissue on the inside causing irritation on the inside of the kneecap because that stretching phenomenon is pulling on some of that. So that can be another subset where you'd want to look at all these factors and say, does that match your symptoms and on your pain, where the inside of your knee joint is actually what's the irritative thing, and the inside of the kneecap is also getting stretched, the MPFL or some of the retinacular tissue connecting the knee to the actual back of the knee joint. That could be irritated as well. That's another kind of phenomenon, right? A third phenomenon would be global compression, right? So when I talked about maybe stiffness of the quad or not landing in the best strategy or not having a good strength balance of your knee can cause you to have a lot more pressure pushing down on the knee joint. The kneecap could be getting pushed into the knee joint. So when it bends or when it takes force, it's not gliding well. It's kind of rubbing a little bit too hard, right? That could just be a global compression phenomenon where the quad being stiff or maybe some of the landing strategies are causing that global compression to happen. That's kind of more of a diffuse, kind of generalized achy pain. People are like, it kind of hurts all in the front a little bit, sometimes the inside. That could just be the back of the kneecap getting aggravated or the soft tissue around the kneecap itself becoming irritated as well. That's global compression, okay? You can also have, again, fat pad irritation, which is, again, that fat pad is below the kneecap and it's sitting right behind the patellar tendon, kind of connecting those the shin bone behind the kneecap to prevent excessive pain or friction going on there. There's a bursa back there as well, which is just a fluid-filled sac. Okay, in Scott Dye's study, the fat pad was highly irritative in people, right? And the way that this is kind of happening sometimes, again, overuse, workload issues, proper landing patterns, strength conditioning, all sorts of factors can cause this. But what's happening is that fat pad is becoming inflamed and irritated. And if it swells up a little bit, it can become caught or irritated by the kneecap bumping into it, or when you land, the compression of it. So the bursa can become irritated, but the fat pad itself can also become irritated as well. And you would look at this with a fat pad impingement test, which is where you have somebody kind of bend their knee to 30 degrees. You put your knee under their knee and you kind of like have them actively extend their knee, and they see if they have pain below their kneecap. Then you can squish their fat pad and kind of squeeze it together and lift it up a little bit so it's not so much in the joint. And if they actively extend again and that changes their pain, maybe the inflammation or the fat pad being cranky is causing some of their problems, okay? That's a very different type of knee pain than the other four because it involves the lower knee joint and it involves the fat pad, not so much the kinematics or the way the kneecap is moving, okay? That's another thing that we can have going on. Another issue we could have is a quad tendinopathy or a patellar tendinopathy. We could have pain above the kneecap and the quad tendon from landing or force or not having the strength capacity. Or we could have an issue going on below the knee joint with the patellar tendon itself that goes from the kneecap down to the shin bone. That's becoming irritated again because maybe the workloads are too high or the strength capacity is too low or the tendon has gone through many different issues that we'll talk about where it kind of gets degenerative over time. That's another type of knee patellofemoral pain that could be happening going on, right? And then lastly, if you have some kind of issues or pain on the outside of your knee by your IT band, your saphenous nerve could become irritated from compression of your IT band and repetitive bending and flexing of your knee with high force. That's a completely different type, right? A lot of people have that repetitive running or biking or repetitive landings, right? So all these different things you would have to break down with these tests of looking at the kneecap tracking, looking at them squat and move, checking their hip, checking their strength, checking their fat pad test, checking the different side-to-side movement of the kneecap with instability. A lot of different stuff that can be going on, right? That's the last thing I'll mention is kneecap, is you could just have patellar instability where someone has a really shallow knee groove that it sits in, the trochlea, and someone has a very odd-shaped kneecap, just slightly more genetically predisposed to this, where the train doesn't stay on the tracks. It slides outside of the knee joint with landing or movement. That could cause the kneecap itself to bump out and then bump back in. And obviously that's going to cause contact between the bone, the back of the kneecap and the outside of the trochlea. It could cause some irritation there and cause some bone bruising, but also the soft tissue gets stretched out quite a bit when somebody has a subluxation of their knee. That's a completely different type of kneecap, right? So you have to have the tools in your head to understand the anatomy, which is why we went through it, to break down all the things that this could be. Every single one of those is going to have a very different approach to treatment and a very different approach to return to sport, between strengthening or bracing or looking at different taping techniques or trying to understand the workloads and modify them, or strength and conditioning. They will all have many different approaches to that. So you have to have a really good understanding and break those things down to have a really good setup for success with their rehab process. Okay. The next most common thing you're going to hear about would be growth plate injuries. Okay. So we're going to have two main growth plate injuries here. So one is the most popular, which is Osgood Schlatters. Okay. Osgood Schlatters is essentially the growth plate of the top of the shin bone, right? So right where your kneecap goes to your patellar tendon and attaches, there's this little bump here called your tibial tuberosity. That essentially is where the patellar tendon inserts to. And when you're younger, particularly under the age of 14 years old, there's a growth plate there that's open. Okay. So the growth plate being open means that it's not fully fused yet together into hard bone. It's more of a spongy kind of soft bone. And it allows somebody to grow and get taller, but it also makes the situation where they're not really able to take force so well because it's vulnerable. It's not hard, firm bone. Okay. So a combination of high impacts, high training loads, going a little bit too fast too soon, maybe not being strong enough, not having proper landing patterns, doing too much too fast, that can cause the bone to become inflamed. And that is Osgood Schlatters. So some people will try to just work through it, and some people will try to use like a patellar tendon strap. But unfortunately, the only thing getting you out of this one is going to be resting from impact, getting a proper strength program, dealing with any hip or ankle issues, then slowly returning back to sports, right? There's no way around it that it's probably going to take 2 to 4 to 8 weeks to slowly go through this once you have a really bad flare-up. And so that is, that's the Osgood Schlatters. That's what that is. Bone irritation is bone inflammation. There's another lesser known one that sometimes happens, which is there's a growth plate at the bottom portion of the kneecap. So right where the kneecap starts to become the patellar tendon, you have another growth plate right at the bottom of your inferior pole of your patella. And this one is called Sinden, Jarsen, Lohanssen syndrome, which is literally just 3 doctors who all discovered it together and wanted their names on it. So lower portion of the kneecap, right? That growth plate can also become inflamed, combination of a lot of high stress. But as I talked about, that lower tip of the kneecap makes contact as it kind of is that first 20 degrees of knee bending. That can be an issue too as well, again, causing some problems. All right. In the research, one of the highest things you hear reported is just this internal derangement. And I say that with air quotes, right? So again, not the most helpful diagnostic. I think what happens sometimes is certain programs where people want to maybe just generalize injuries to not be specific about what the injury is. So they claim it as just an internal derangement or a sprain or just a knee joint injury or something like that. But this really has a large combination of factors that go into it. So obviously, the biggest internal derangement we see most often is an ACL tear. So what happens is when somebody lands, either if their knee twists and pivots inward or has what's called a dynamic valgus, which is where it caves in towards each other, but also sometimes if they have a hyperextension, they land lock-legged and it bends backwards, you can tear the ACL. Right. You have a continuum here where you might have just a sprain of the ACL, which is just, it doesn't tear. It just gets stretched really quick and it becomes irritated and inflamed. Then you can have partial tears where somebody lands, but it doesn't fully tear, but it's partially torn. That's usually called somebody who's ACL deficient if it fully tears and they're still walking around with it, or if it's a partial tear. Then obviously a full rupture would be if somebody rips all the way through it. And oftentimes with this, you have a second category of internal derangement, which is an MCL injury. So same kind of idea. The pivoting and the twisting can cause the MCL to be strained, right? There's kind of a global overview that I talked about in the ankle injuries, which is a grade 1, a grade 2, and a grade 3 strain. So a grade 1 strain would just be that it stretches, but it doesn't actually tear. A grade 2 strain would be it actually has a micro tearing of it, and there is some really serious tissue damage, but it's not fully torn. A grade 3 would be a full rupture of that ligament, so the MCL in this case. Right. It's commonly injured with the ACL, but there is also times where you can just have a really rapid dipping outward of the knee, and the knee gaps on the inside and causes a bowing. So that can cause an MCL injury. It typically, like I said, has more blood flow to this area. So sometimes they won't operate on it unless it's severe. They'll just try to make sure it's mitigated with activity modification. But oftentimes with an MCL injury, bending the knee also hurts quite a bit as well, because there's portions of that are connected to the joint capsule, connected to the knee joint itself. So bending of the knee can cause some problems as well. But obviously there's going to be a lot of inflammation, a lot of swelling that goes on, right? An ACL is usually like a classic kind of like you hear a pop, right? And then the knee joint swells up, over the course of a couple of hours right away. Whereas an MCL might be like, not a pop or a tear, but you feel it stretch and it hurts right away. And slowly over time, you see the inside of the knee joint swell and get puffy. There's some tenderness on the inside when you try to strum the MCL a little bit or sit in a figure 4 position. All right. So those are kind of other ones that happen. I'm going in order of commonality, not in terms of like just through the anatomy. But another big internal derangement we already talked about is a meniscus tear, right? So this can happen with awkward landings, hyperextensions. If you hyperextend, you might stress the front of the anterior portion of the meniscus. If somebody bends their knee very forcefully or lands awkward and pivots, it can damage the back of the meniscus. Pivoting and twisting can cause different damage to the meniscus as well. There's degenerative meniscus tears that happen slowly over time from repetitive impact, but you can also have these acute tears, which are called like radial tears or flap tears or longitudinal tears, bucket handle tears, different just types of the way the tissue is tearing inside and outside. Okay. The medial meniscus is typically more commonly injured, just the position of the knee caving. And if you get an ACL, MCL, and medial meniscus tear together, you often get what's called an unhappy triad. That's kind of a big, devastating injury. But also, as the knee joint itself dislocates when you have the ACL, the outside femur bone whacks into the bottom really, really hard, and it can cause a bone bruising. The femoral condyle can get bone bruised in an ACL injury, or someone can whack their bones together really quick. Those are typically some of the most painful parts of an ACL injury, is that like dynamic whacking of the bones together. And you'll see that on MRI. It's present for a long, long time. Right. So lots of meniscus mechanisms here. Again, hyperextension, hyperflexion, twisting and pivoting under axial load when they land. A lot of these things can happen. A root tear can sometimes happen in younger athletes, which is where they kind of pull off a piece of the bone where the meniscus attaches to the bone, which obviously is a little bit more involved and has some issues. But lots of different types of meniscus tears can happen here. There's a large spectrum of recovery times based on type of tear and degenerative versus acute versus how much trauma was done to the knee. So those are also inside the joint. Okay, and then LCL and PCL tears can happen as well. LCL tear would be the opposite, which is when the knee kind of bows outward. It's not as common, but you can tear the outside lateral portion of the knee capsule and the knee joint together, the LCL. Sometimes you have what are called PLC injuries, or posterior lateral corner injuries, which involve rotation. And then the PCL itself is typically mainly with hyperextension of the knee, or that kneecap or that knee joint moving backwards on itself if somebody hyperextends their knee. The ACL can be torn as well with hyperextension injuries, but the PCL is typically the most stressed first. And you would see that with somebody who has what's called a stag sign, or when they put their knee, it's like a shelf sign where the knee is sitting backwards relative to it. Whereas an ACL, you wouldn't see that, but you'd also do like a pivot shift, you do a Lockman's test, all that kind of stuff. All right. So that's kind of the inside of the knee, right? The main ligaments, LCLs, meniscus, stuff like that. We'll get into cartilage a little bit below. But the next thing I want to talk about in terms of most common is going to be tendinopathies. So tendon issues as well. And in the ankle podcast, I talked a lot about how it exists kind of on a continuum here, right? So Joe Cook's research is really helpful here. And what they talk about is how on the left side of the continuum, you can have an acute kind of tendinitis, which involves very much an inflammatory process. So say, for example, you land a lot of times in a short period of time and your kneecap's not quite ready for it, your preseason or whatever else it is, your patellar tendon or your quad tendon can get very, very irritated, inflamed, and kind of cranky. That's like a true tendinitis, right? But as this happens over and over again, and you kind of go through instances where the knee gets irritated or the knee tendon itself starts to become cranky, you can have this repetitive cycle where it gets injured. It doesn't really fully rehab. The strength conditioning isn't done fully. You go back right away. It's under recovered. That causes another irritation. And this starts to happen over and over again over multiple cycles, like jumper's knee, for example. And what happens is the tendon itself starts to change maybe. And there's a lot of debate here, whether it's, that the type of collagen changing is causing some irritation. It's not as strong and healthy, or there's nerves that grow inside the tendon that are also problematic, or there's some increase in blood vessels, neovascularization that happens in the tendon. But essentially, the tendon itself goes through a degenerative process where the type of collagen that usually is really strong, really firm, really aligned, and handles force well starts to get replaced with not the healthiest type of collagen. And it starts to be not as well equipped to handle load. And so this is where maybe that load starts to stack up and it becomes painful because of the load differential imbalance where the workload is high, but the tendon's capacity to handle that force is not really optimal, or the recovery is not quite there. So now it becomes a chronic kind of cranky degenerative tendon situation. And then all the way on the right side of the tendon, you can have what's called a tendon rupture or a tendon tear, right? So you can tear your quad tendon, you can tear your patellar tendon. Typically much harder to do, and it causes quite a bit of high force because of the trauma and the nature of it. But that is the all the way other side, is when somebody has a patellar tendon rupture or a quad tendon rupture, okay? So if you look at the research on maybe why these occur, I think capacity and workload is generally the most accepted, which is the workload is high on the tendon. Like I said, in college, where they're competing back-to-back weekends, or we have thousands of impacts, right? We have that going on. But then also we can have situations where maybe the landing strategy and the strength conditioning preparation on the tendon is not quite adequate to handle what's going on. And somebody may land in a more stiffer, slightly more bent knee strategy, not a full depth stranding, hip and dominant knee together. And this has been shown by Warp 2014, saying that a stiffer landing strategy was with less flexibility in their landing patterns was associated with patellar tendinopathy. But also this can happen in quad tendinopathy as well. So essentially what we think might be happening is that because the strength of the tendon is not there with strength conditioning preparation, the workload is high on the tendon, it can constantly get irritated or cause that degenerative cycle. Then someone who lands very, very stiff is just putting all the force or the majority of the force on certain areas like the patellar tendon or the kneecap, and it's not spreading that force out throughout multiple areas like the hip, the ankle, and the knee altogether, or using the muscles like the hamstring and the quads to help out. So that could be problematic over time, right? And there are some pieces of evidence that patellar tendon straps can be helpful to buffer those forces, but they're not a great cure-all, right? Like they're just changing the force, maybe deloading the tendon as well, which is great, but time away from workloads, a proper strength conditioning program, and a proper ramp up to the proper workload is going to be the most important thing we have here, okay? So patellar tendon straps, as Rosen in 2017 did show that it helps a little bit with reducing pain. But again, our ideal goal is to help manage the workload and get somebody better physically prepared with strength conditioning and proper slowly adding in of impacts and of workload and running and stuff like that. Okay. Other thing that can happen on the back of the knee is a distal hamstring tendinopathy. So this is where the hamstring tendons go behind the knee and attach down to the lower knee bone. You could argue this is part of the hip category, but I think it's close to the knee. So this typically is a similar situation where sudden increases in running, sprinting, jumping, leaps and jumps in particular, or kicks, dance type elements or flares. It can cause a lot of eccentric stress or stretching stress when the muscles contracting, and it can cause the tendon to break down. Again, if you're not doing things like single leg RDLs or Nordic hamstring curls, these can easily become irritated on people because they suddenly jump into a lot of sprinting or jumping or running, and it causes the tendon to get a little cranky and irritable, right? So those are kind of the main categories of tendinopathies. The next thing I think we briefly touched on, but I want to just go back to, is going to be patellar instability or patellar dislocation. So that train sits on the train track, and again, it can move side to side if the track itself is twisting or if there's a lot of movement of the knee. Some people are predisposed with this genetically because they're really hypermobile and have a lot of natural flexibility in their joint capsules and ligaments. You can use a Beighton scale to measure that, but also that groove that the kneecap is made up of called the trochlea. If the trochlea is not deep enough and it's shallow, it might predispose the kneecap to kind of go sliding outwards, damaging the inside knee ligament, the MPFL, but also on the outside causing some issues. So you can have some instability, which is just that it kind of slides around a little bit and causes some excessive damage. The next progression of that with higher force landing or kind of injuries of overload would be a subluxation, which is where the kneecap kind of pops out of the knee joint and then pops back in, and it doesn't need to be reduced for the doctor. But that obviously popping in and out is extremely unsettling, but it also causes some stretching of the soft tissue. But on the way out, what happens is the back of the kneecap, the underside of the train, can whack the outside train track and cause some damaging and bone bruising to the back of the knee, which can cause some cartilage issues or bone bruises. And that's obviously, quite problematic as well the more it happens. Then on the all the way side spectrum is a patellar dislocation, which is the train essentially jumps completely off the tracks on the outside and it's truly stuck out. And you see someone whose kneecap is unfortunately popped out to the side. They sometimes have to get it reduced, go to the ER, it pops in back itself. But obviously that is very traumatic. And sometimes what can happen is it can damage the structures on the inside of the kneecap. The MPFL might need to get reconstructed and have surgery to put that back in place. Or sometimes they want to reposition or deepen the trochlear groove to make it sit a little bit more inside. Some much more involved surgeries might do a tibial osteoplasty where they move the tibial tubercle with the patellar tendon attaches to. They move it over a little bit, and that changes the way the kneecap kind of slides up and down. That's a much more involved surgery, but just want to kind of set the spectrum of instability, which is just soft tissue irritation and kind of bone bruising, all the way to surgery for correcting some of the anatomy that someone has genetically is problematic. All right. So next thing we have going on here would be just bone bruises, which matches up well with patellar issues. So the high forces are real in gymnastics, right? So you can have a situation where over time, somebody progressively just lands or has a high workload and has not the best strength to handle those forces. And the same spot gets whacked over and over and over again, right? So if I just took my, my finger and I started scratching my hand here, if I just kept scratching the exact same spot over and over and over for a couple hours, I would start to get inflammation and redness and irritation and bleeding, right? Well, that's the same thing that's happening sometimes on the bones themselves. Those femur and tibia bones matching together, if you keep hitting the same spot over and over and over again, you can have bone bruises on the bone, but you can also have cartilage issues on the weight-bearing portion of the cartilage, which is what we'll talk about in a second. So just hitting the same spot over and over again can be really problematic. That happens a lot on the kneecap, where someone gets this diffuse achy, just like, all kind of feels crappy because the bone is getting irritated. So that can happen slowly over time. But also this can morph with one big incident. So I see this a lot. And sometimes someone will land in a lock-legged position. And because their knee is more locked, the front portion of the bones on the train tracks hit each other really hard. And you can get a tibial plateau bone bruise of the tibial plateau, which is the front part of the knee that's resting on top. You can have the femur bone whack into the front bone really, really hard, and you can get a tibial bone bruise. Or you can have a situation where somebody lands awkwardly and gets a different portion of the bone to be bruised, and you would see this on X-ray or MRI, right? So this happens really all the time. And sometimes, unfortunately, these awkward landings that are predisposed by, again, strength issues, workload issues, not the best landing patterns, can cause a significant bone bruise, and someone's really laid up for quite some time. That happens quite a bit. And the natural progression of this is going to be a stress fracture, right? So if somebody keeps hitting the same spot over and over and over again, particularly when they're younger and they're not strong enough to handle it, they can actually fracture the condyle itself or the femur bone itself, or they can fracture the tibia. They can start to get a stress hairline fracture down their kneecap. And you would see this as being very, very painful on X-ray and MRI. But someone can't really jump. They can't really touch it. It's really painful. If you squeeze their knee into a squeeze test, they feel quite a bit of pain. You can test for femoral stress fractures as well with it's in the hip, but you can also squeeze the knee and bending and see if that extreme bending motion causes some of these stresses to happen on the knee. There's stress fractures that happen very, very commonly over time. And of course, with stress fractures, we always have to consider nutritional deficits, people who might have an underfueling situation or a caloric deficit that's causing the bone mineral density to be lower, or has some red S syndrome. That's always something we think about with these athletes that might have struggle with this. But you can also just get, straight up fractures, right? You can have someone who lands really awkward or really low or under rotated, and they fracture their knee, they fracture their tibia, they fracture their ankle and their knee together. Or, I've seen some really gnarly fractures of a femur where someone landed, on one leg on a double back on bars, for example, and fractured their femur because it was just a 1 in a million awkward position. So all sorts of these, fractures can happen. Typically, it's less common like the ankle or the arm because the weight-bearing bones are very strong. But stress fractures are common, cartilage issues are common, fractures are common, and these things kind of suck because they take a long time. They oftentimes need surgery to correct or pin or cast or stuff like that. So those can happen quite a bit as well. On this kind of theory and this kind of progressive overuse type stuff, the last thing I want to mention is just cartilage issues. So again, the backside of the kneecap has cartilage, and also the bottom portions of the trains meeting together, train tracks meeting together have cartilage. So the bottom of the femur, the top of the tibia. So you can have cartilage issues that happen because you're hitting the same spot over and over again. Like the back of the kneecap can have cartilage wear, but also the cartilage in the bottom portion of the femur can get worn down quite a bit as well. And again, you just keep hitting the same spot over and over again. Sometimes it's not the bone that's irritated, right? And an older athlete who doesn't have an open growth plate and doesn't have the necessary, open vulnerable spots for the bone, the shift then goes towards the tendons and the cartilage and the weight-bearing portions of the bone. And if someone's had a long career where lots and lots of repetitive overuse things have happened, the cartilage itself may start to break down. And so there's layers of cartilage 1 through 4. The first layer and second layer sometimes get irritated and it goes farther, and it can cause much more deeper cartilage issues. The formal term this is called usually is osteochondritis dissecans, which essentially just means that you've hit the same spot in the cartilage over and over again with repetitive overuse and a lack of strength or a lack of proper landing techniques or workload issues. And that one spot has gone from a bruising to an inflammation to a degeneration to a slowly that the bone is starting to die, the cartilage is starting to die, and starting to affect the underside of the bone and the deeper portions. And so they typically with, grade 1 or grade 2 cartilage issues will have somebody rest and do rehab and just let it heal. But if it's a 3 or a 4 with bone fragments or pieces that are in the joint, they do an Oates procedure, which is essentially where they take a piece of cartilage from a non-weight bearing portion of that bone and they plug it into the hole. They might do a microfracture too as well, which is where they kind of pick at the bone to cause some positive bleeding. But those are much more involved surgeries. They take a long time, and they're much more extensive than just the grade 1 irritation of the bone bruise. All right. So next, as we move into this monster podcast, right? So just some timeline things here to be thinking about. So there's a lot of high variability here with timelines, right? You have things that are based on age, level, goals, genetic predisposition, how many past injuries they had, how many past surgeries they had, all sorts of stuff can go into this. So it's going to be a range here, and I'll give you some timelines, but I don't want someone to think that, patellar tendon issue in one person is going to take it, less than another because of just they're both patellar tendon issues, right? It could take much, much longer to do that kind of stuff. All right. So timelines for injuries will be highly variable, but typically for like lower grade strains, not as irritative muscle things, you might have 2 to 4 weeks if it's caught early, right? Someone who has like a growth plate irritation or a stress fracture or has some sort of a cartilage issue, a really gnarly tendinopathy can sometimes take like 4 to 8 weeks to really resolve and kind of get them back. And you're going to have things like ACL tears, meniscus tears, OCD lesions, fractures, right? Those are huge injuries, right? Those take much, much longer to deal with. Those are mostly going to be in the 3 to 6 month range, but all the way up to like 9+ to a year, we'd like to say for some, like particularly in ACL tears and cartilage issues. To get somebody fully back safely and reduce the risk of injury, it might be up to a year to really get that person back to full gymnastics, right? And you hear like cleared, for example, but medically cleared is very different than cleared to do all your gymnastics and be mentally and physically and emotionally ready for that. So keep that in mind, that those timelines are highly variable, but that's kind of the overall that I think about, right? And when you move into what needs to happen to get somebody through these injury timelines better, I always talk about 4 phases, which I talked about in the ankle one as well, but I'm going to keep repeating it because it's important, right? We have 4 main phases that I like to talk to athletes about from the very beginning. The acute phase will be that kind of damage control, put the fire out phase. It's usually around 0 to 4 weeks, up to 6 weeks, depending on the injury you have. All right, and that's just about kind of controlling the knee joint itself, and I'll talk about what needs to happen there. The second phase is going to be the intermediate phase, which is usually anywhere from like 4 to 6 weeks up to 12 weeks, depending on the injury you're dealing with. That's about just being a normal human again, right? Stairs, walking, driving, school, not about athletics, okay? That's the second phase. The third phase, which is I call just being athlete again, which is anywhere from like the 12-week phase all the way up to maybe like the 4 to 5 month phase, so 20 to 24 weeks as well. That's about being athletic again. That's about being jump, run, skip, power, right? Lift weights, do all that kind of stuff. And lastly, from the 5 month on, depending on the injury you have, this could be sped up 3 months if it's a minor injury, or 2 months for a minor injury. But essentially getting back to gymnastics is be a gymnast again, which is slowly going through the return to sport phase, right? So I think about these things, and every single time I work with somebody with a knee injury, right, in the acute phase we'll talk about right now, what's the first most important thing is just stabilizing the athlete, right? Somebody has an injury or has an issue, you got to rule out red flags. You got to make sure it's not a fracture, there's no vascular damage, no neural damage. You want to get imaging if somebody is suspected to have an ACL tear or a fracture, right? That's like an athletic trainer's job. Mostly you're just getting somebody to get to the proper people to make sure it's not a serious, devastating injury. That is always the most important thing first, right? And then most times, if someone has one of those more severe injuries, it's about stabilizing them enough with like crutches or crutches and non-weight bearing, just to get them imaging and time to go see a knee specialist or an orthopedic surgeon or something like that. So that's always the first kind of like ground zero must happen right away. But beyond that, okay, we have the big rocks, I call them, of the acute phase, right? So number one is going to be managing swelling, right? The knee joint itself is very prone to swell up quite a bit because of the synovial fluid, the joint capsule, all that kind of stuff. So inflammation and swelling is good. That's how we heal stuff. We get blood flow, right? But we don't want to let somebody have a huge puffy knee, because that's going to change how the knee joint moves and how it bends, okay? So a really classic study by McKnight in 1996 showed that small amount of fluid injection, that's 30 cc's of salines, reduces the quad's output, right? So that's kind of a built-in protection mechanism to prevent against injuries. But it's problematic because if you don't have quad control, you can't walk very well, right? So what we want to do first is always manage the swelling, always manage the pain. And the best way to do this, right, is some sort of compression, some sort of elevation, and some sort of active motion. Those are really the 3 big pillars. So I always advocate for people to either use an ACE wrap, funneling it with being a little bit tighter on the shin and a little bit less tight going up the knee, or wearing a knee sleeve when they have an acute injury that's the right size for them to make sure it's not too painful. But trying to be as lightly active as possible within reason. If you can't move your knee bend a lot, putting your foot up, moving your ankle up and down, doing some quad sets, doing some glute squeezes, just getting some activation of the muscle to pump through some of that fluid, right? The elevation, obviously with gravity, will pull it down to your heart. So that's very, very important. Ice has moved out of favor in terms of being like a good anti-inflammatory, so to speak. I don't think it's really got great support anymore to be like the thing that takes away swelling, because it's not so much about ice is constricting the area now, so we don't have good blood flow in and out. So we want to go more the active movement, the compression, that kind of stuff. Caveat, I said this in the last lecture, there are some times when ice is probably helpful for pain management. If somebody has a very acute, like blowout injury and they tear their ACL and they're screaming in pain, that's not the time to be like, well, the research doesn't support, the use of ice for swelling management. It's like, this person's screaming in pain. I've had some kids get acutely injured and are like writhing in pain. And someone's like, we shouldn't use ice. It's not going to prevent the healing. It's like, okay, this is an ethical decision of just being a good human, of like 5 to 10 minutes of ice to help this person from going into shock is probably the better option here, okay? And there are other times too as well that acutely after a big surgery, someone's in so much pain that they can't sleep, they can't move, they can't do their exercises, and that negatively impacts the swelling management and the healing. So sometimes after a big surgery like that, using a little bit of ice in the short term can help to not only, I'm not talking about swelling management, but it takes their pain down a little bit so that they can move more comfortably, which is what we want for swelling management. So I've probably reduced the amount of ice I've used by 90%. But there are still some selected times when I do use ice, and I think it's valid. So, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in a situation. Mike Ronald, my boss, has a phenomenal blog post on this on his website if you want to get to the weeds of the research with Phil Page and some other people. But there are some times that I'm still using ice. Not a lot anymore, but there are still some times. So I just want to kind of mention that. So swelling management through compression and motion and stuff like that is really, really important. The second thing we really want to do is we want to try to regain some of that mobility or maintain the mobility that we can while the tissue is calming down. Okay, the way we do this is with the local joint mobility of the knee, but also soft tissue mobility, right? So joint mobility, we want to make sure the train can move down and up and side to side in the train tracks. If there's so much swelling and irritation that the train gets really, really stiff and it can't move, it's going to be hard to bend the knee because the knee bending requires the kneecap moving up and down. So we're doing a lot of joint glides to the kneecap itself. So moving joint mobilizations up and down, side to side. You can teach someone to self-mobilize a little bit, help get some of that swelling moving around a little bit, that fluid moving around a little bit, which helps the kneecap move a little bit better, right? We don't do as much with the tibial femoral joint itself. We're probably not gliding that joint a ton. Some light joint mobilizations might help out, but it's typically more the patella we're working with and doing just passive range of motion or active range of motion to try to get that mobility back naturally. But moving the kneecap, getting the swelling out is really important. And then also soft tissue flexibility is sometimes really, really important because somebody might be painful and not walking a lot. So quad soft tissue work, hamstring soft tissue work, calf soft tissue work to help the knee bend more comfortably. Remember, the hamstring, the quad, and the calf all go across the knee joint. Quad goes over the top of the kneecap in the front, hamstring goes behind the knee in the back, and the calf goes behind the knee in the back as well, the gastroc, not the soleus. So if someone's struggling with knee extension or someone's struggling with knee bending, sometimes doing quad soft tissue work, hamstring soft tissue stuff to prevent that guarding or reduce that tone, not so much make the tissue magically more flexible, but reducing tone, increasing blood flow, using heat along with that will help get that bending to happen more comfortably. Okay. So some combination of kneecap moving, soft tissue work, tools, cupping. That's not, whatever your fancy kind of works. I'm not a purist on one thing. I think they all are non-specific and they reduce tone. They're not really hardcore changing tissue quality. So whatever you feel is comfortable. And then I always do passive range of motion as I've gotten taught by Mike and Lenny, is doing it seated over the edge of the table. So I think that's much more comfortable than laying someone on their back and cranking on their knee, which is what I used to do. And it didn't have great results, but sitting over the edge of a table, bending their knee fully is allowing. Lenny's really big promotion of this provides more comfort for the person in front of you. It's much more calm, much more easy. You can talk with them, chat with them. It's not like you're cranking on their knee while they lay on their back. So I typically sit somebody up and do that nice, slow knee bending for a lot of bouts of consistent motion. And I'll have them do that with themselves using their other leg, kind of bending their knee up and down, back and forth, side to side, back and forth over the course of multiple bouts throughout the day. So then soft tissue work, self-patellar mobs, if it's not that bad, obviously foam rolling, stretching, stuff like that where it's appropriate. But that's kind of the acute phase I do for that. Okay, nextly is the biggest thing for the knee is also maintaining or building strength. So in this phase, we're going to talk about doing as many low-level exercises that we can that are tolerable, that are going to promote some good blood flow in the area. So quad sets, hamstring sets, ankle pumps, glute squeezes. If you can do some knee bending, some nice and easy knee bending. I'm a fan of doing all of these exercises, especially when it's early and painful. It's like swelling and stuff after surgery, after acute injury, straight leg raises, for example, and stuff. But I quickly move on for these as fast as I can within a couple of weeks because I want to promote more activity and more movement in these people, right? Sometimes with like a protocol, ACL, cartilage, you're restricted for a couple of weeks of how far you can bend or how far you can do exercises. But generally, I want to get somebody moving faster, right? So we're trying to get to knee extensions over the edge of the table, right? Hamstring curls, mini squats, weight shifts, low box step ups, calf raises, knee extensions, hip extensions, side plank clamshells, all that kind of stuff we're trying to do as fast as we can to try to get blood pumping through the body. Get someone on a bike and see if you can do partial motion or use their arms and legs together. All that stuff is going to be really, really important. And we're also trying to do as much stuff for the ankle and for the hip as we possibly can. Like I said, side plank clamshells, side plank holds if they're tolerable, donkey kicks, quadruped bird dogs, like whatever they can tolerate. As much possible workload maintenance as we can do in this phase is really, really good. And I think that this is really important to understand that some discomfort is normal, but it's not going to be something we want to blow through pain for. So I generally tell people that if it's about a 3 out of 10, and it doesn't increase in symptoms the night or the day after, that's probably a good loading response. Every 2 to 3 days, we want to see that progression of force and not having too much crankiness, right? So I keep that in mind with people. But another really important thing here is going to be blood flow restriction training is a phenomenal way to maintain some of their strength at this point, right? So they can't load a lot, but if you do blood flow restriction training and you can get some hypertrophy or some maintenance through metabolic mechanisms, you can do low-level exercises with a high repetition rate and really get a lot of great exercises. And so there's a lot of great research on the ACL side of blood flow restriction training and how it's been helpful, but I think there's a lot of really good support that it's good to do some hypertrophy training and do some low-level exercise per the bike, for example, or some straight leg raises or some mini squats, and just go through that with your tourniquets on and do that. So I do a ton of this kind of stuff early on, right? But the big takeaway point is that I really want to say that consistency is really the goal here. Consistency over intensity, particularly in the acute phase, is what we're going to be kind of working on, right? We're going to be working on issues above and below in the hip like crazy and in the ankle like crazy. We're going to be working the knee as much as we can, but I'd rather pick basic exercises that are achievable, consistently done over multiple times per day, like with range of motion and exercise stuff, than blasting somebody a couple times per week with maybe too many exercises and getting their knee kind of cranky and kind of sore. All right. Last thing in this acute phase is going to be getting back to normal walking and normal gait patterns, right? So progression of crutches from 2 to 1, 1 to 0, maybe over the course of a week. You do a couple more hours in the morning where you're walking on one crutch with your foot, or 2 crutches with your feet down. You slowly work your way down to 1. And then over the next course of a week, you go from 1 crutch to no crutches. If you have a brace that your doctor allows you to unlock once your quad comes back on, you're just slowly weaning over the course of 2 to 3 weeks. And you're trying to get back to a normal walking pattern because 1, that helps the quad and the calf muscle pump blood in and out in a healthy way throughout the body. But also 2 is that it really helps to get that confidence back and get that mental confidence back around we're getting somewhere, we're making progress. So I'm usually trying to get the strength going, but I really want walking to be normalized first off. So that is the acute phase, long one there, but I wanted to make sure because people have a lot of questions about that. As you get to the intermediate phase, really this is all about strength and conditioning for me. This is all about trying to make sure somebody is getting strong and someone is getting back to a baseline level of function to do their daily activities, okay? So I always think about strength and conditioning in the form of basic movement patterns and then accessory work kind of built in there too. So the main movement patterns that we're trying to get back to would be a hinging pattern, a squatting pattern, a split pelvis pattern, a single leg pattern, and some sort of accessory work or balance work, okay? So I typically promote that someone should try to find the best way to go about these exercises that aren't going to increase symptoms in that kind of 3 out of 10 range. But I typically start somebody with a hip dominant exercise because the knee can't tolerate it quite well. So things like double leg glute bridges, for example, and then maybe moving to a single leg glute bridge, for example, on the table or a hip lift. Then moving to maybe a TRX assisted reverse lunge because it takes some weight off of their hands, but it helps them step back onto their knee with more of a hip dominant strategy. Then moving maybe to a low box step up on one leg, then maybe moving to a goblet squat, and then maybe moving to like a step down, which is the most intense on the knee, right? That might be a 4-week progression of going from more of a hip dominant exercise to more of a mixed hip and knee together, and then going to finally a knee dominant exercise that might be tolerated more well. But I'm essentially trying to find a way to build a program around these main patterns, right? So squatting, for example, I might try to get a box squat, goblet box squat down with their heels elevated to take some pressure off their knee. That might be one movement we do. And then on another day, we might do a single leg hip lift or a weighted glute bridge, right? Or some sort of a deadlift, a kettlebell deadlift, right? I might put those on opposite days. For split pelvis, we might do a TRX assisted split squat and then move to a regular split squat to an RX pad. And then maybe down the road, move to some sort of an elevated split squat, right? With goblets or doblets, something like that. Or goblets or dumbbells or something like that. Single leg exercises, single leg deadlifts, single leg step ups, all that kind of stuff is really, really good. But I'm trying to make the meat and potatoes of my program be those main movements and then just change maybe the tempo or the range of motion, 2x RX pads or a lower box, or change the weight they're using or how many sets and reps we're doing to kind of manipulate to make sure it's comfortable. That's really the main thing that I'm doing in my intermediate phase, is trying to build that program. The accessory work is going to be a combination of hip and ankle work and then direct accessory single joint loading for the knee. So for the ankle, for example, I might be doing seated calf raises, standing calf raises, right? For the hip, side plank clamshell, side plank leg lift. The hip lifts kind of count as well, but core work, plank, side plank, front plank, that's accessory work. We're also going to want to do some sort of balance or dynamic stability work, which is crucial for the knee to help teach the hip and the ankle to help stabilize the knee. So starts with weight shifts onto an RX pad. Maybe we do single leg balance with ball rebounders at a wall. We might progress that to a sport cord where it's wrapped around their hip. So it's resistance, leaning onto the side, going back, catching a ball back and forth. All that kind of stuff goes into balance. We have some slosh tubes that are half filled with water that we can move, and the water moves around. That's a really great dynamic stability exercise. That's kind of also in the accessory piece. So I would fill those into maybe a warm-up or in some of the working sets. And then lastly, we do want to keep continuing with direct quad loading and direct hamstring loading. I think that gets a bad rap sometimes that we're not directly loading enough. So I still do knee extensions. I still do step downs. I still do some hamstring curls. Again, BFR might end the session with that. I still do some biking and stuff like that. I want to directly load the knee, the quad, the tissue of the knee, the patellar tendon, the hamstring tendons. I want to get that compression loading because that's going to be important down the road. So the program, this intermediate phase, right? It might be 3 to 4 sets of 8 to 12 of a main movement, and then maybe 2 sets or 3 sets of 10 of a balance thing or a calf raise. It might then move its way up to a 5x5 with a little bit heavier load to follow more of a strength building profile. 2 to 3 days per week with some soft tissue stuff and flexibility work in between. All that stuff is kind of built into the intermediate phase. And I would honestly linearly load someone for like 6 weeks getting through that phase just to get them strong, just to get them confident, get them back to kind of the setup for the athletic phase coming next. All right. But that's the majority of what I'd be doing in that middle phase. The third phase, the advanced phase, which is again going to be, but depending on the injury you're working with, it could be as early as 8 to 10 weeks. It could be as late as 4 months, depending on what you're dealing with. But this for me is really all about getting back to higher threshold and more power-based exercises, right? So power, plyometrics, higher loading, right, in strength training, and then higher level dynamic stability and balance work are the 4 big things I'm looking for here in the knee joint. So plyometrics, we'll talk with strength training first because that's going to be the foundation. But strength training, higher load, right? Increasing the range of motion, maybe to do an elevated split squat instead of a regular split squat, a higher box step up with maybe a tempo pause, more load, sled pushes, sled pulls, all that kind of stuff is higher threshold, higher intensity. That's the baseline for strength and capacity and weight bearing on that joint, right? Secondary would be power. So now I'm trying to teach someone to express that strength in a fast way to set them up for the return to sport program. So a lot of the things we're doing here are around like jumping and med ball throws and box jumps and stuff. So I love med ball slams, overhead med ball throws to teach somebody to move really, really quick and fast. I love doing broad jumps and seated dumbbell jumps with no weight first, and then turning that into a band resisted broad jump or a seated dumbbell jump. Those things are fantastic as well. The plyo progression sometimes helps out with that too, which I'll talk about next. But essentially with power work is you're kind of going from slower type movements that are just easy body weight and then progressive overload, like example, a seated dumbbell jump to seated jump without dumbbells to a seated dumbbell jump to maybe repeated dumbbell jumps, right? Or repeated broad jumps or vertical jumps, a body weight double leg jump to a band resisted jump to a repeated broad jumps down the turf. That's kind of the power that I'm trying to work on is double leg progressive overload versus the plyometrics are typically more that explosive kind of quick twitch, fast rebounding, right? So for this, I talked about in the last episode, but I start people with pogo hops, scissor hops, in and out hops, jogging, skipping, side shuffling, karaoke. I do this kind of stuff two to 3 times per week just to reintroduce these light, low levels of plyometric and make sure their knee tolerates it well. Then I'll progress them every 2 weeks or so, right? We progress them to hurdle hops, double leg hurdle hops and stick, then maybe double leg rebounding over the hurdles front, side to side, progress that to a single leg jump and land, then a single leg rebound, maybe a double leg box jump with a depth drop and stick. And then we progress that over 2 weeks to a depth jump, to a jump and a vertical jump after that, like just overload a little bit. That's that general plyometrics. Okay. And then lastly, that dynamic stability training starts to blend with plyometric training because one is that we can do jumping and running drills, sprinting 2 up, 1 back, side to side shuffle. You can point in different directions, have speed time trial tests back and forth of 10 meters, 5 meters. That kind of stuff works, but also we're trying to do higher level jumping and landing, particularly on a single leg. So we might work from a side-to-side jump and stick on just the firm floor. That might then become a side-to-side jump and stick on an AirX pad. And then a week later, it becomes side-to-side jump and stick with a ball toss. And then we do side-to-side jump and stick quarter turn. And then we do side-to-side jump quarter stick with a ball toss, right? Just progressively harder levels of dynamic stability, teaching them to land in a nice 30-degree bent knee angle with a co-contraction and a nice hip dominant strategy that combines protecting the knee. We got to retrain these landing patterns here, which is the last thing that I'll talk about, is that I'm using this time to really hammer proper landing patterns, whether it's 2-legged jumping and landing strategies, right? Or it's 1-legged jumping and landing strategies. We know from Tim Hewitt's work, we know from good patellar tendinopathy research, Silva in 2017, the ACL risk reduction meta-analysis by Hewitt, Lopez, and Hewitt in 2018. We know that if we train proper landing patterns, particularly with ACL injuries, we can possibly reduce their injury risk of 50% in this population of overall injuries and possibly up to 66% in non-contact female MCL injuries if we properly teach landing patterns and use good strength programs. So that's massive, right? That's crucial. So we want to see, and I have lectures that I gave to the NCAA judges and coaches associations, if you want to see this on the website. But essentially, we want to see someone land with their feet, toes, knees, and hips, feet hip width apart, and a nice train track. Again, train track's coming back twice here. But we want to see somebody land from the front with their knees in line with their toes and their hips, not seeing the knees cave in, not seeing the knees bow out. We want to see that nice parallel alignment from the front and nice soft toe ball heel landing. From the side, we'd like to see, importantly, that someone's angle of their chest is the same parallel relatively to their tibia as they squat down to 90 degrees. We're not seeing the trunk pitch really far forward. We're not seeing the trunk really far upright. We're seeing the hips, knees, and the ankles go through angular displacement and bend down to 90 degrees to allow the hamstrings and the quads to co-contract, right? 30-degree at initial contact is helpful, down to 90 degrees when they land more. A relatively open hip angle when they land that sinks down into a nice trunk flex posture to allow the glutes and the hamstrings to kind of co-contract and assist with that braking force, so to speak. That's what we want to teach. So I'm using all these drills, these power drills, these plyometric drills to really be the thing we're talking about quite a bit, right? We also want to talk about air awareness drills and lots of landing strategies to understand what that's going to feel like, okay? Then lastly, in the return to sports phase, two things that are really big happening. One is rebuilding their global capacity, and two is making a specific return to sport guideline program. So capacity work, I think, is really important here to rebuild their aerobic capacity so that they don't get thrown into a 3-hour practice and they're exhausted. But we do a lot of circuits and cardio capacity stuff with bikes, rope slams, med ball slams, loaded carries, sled pushes. We make circuits for them that are maybe like 15 to 20 minutes. Or if they're getting back to running right now, we can do an interval running program right in the advanced phase. Was probably like 3 months, or some issues it's earlier, like 10. I had people start in a walk jog program. So 30-second walk, 30-second jog, move up to 1 minute, 30-second walk, and then move their way up to a continuous bout, of 1 minute on, 1 minute off, or 2 minute on, 1 minute off, up to like 10 to 15 minutes. We expose that as well. But I'm using those programs in the return to sport program along with med ball slams, sleds, pushes, all that kind of stuff to get their heart and lungs back ready for it, because we know that aerobic capacity is one moderator of injury risk from Tim Gabbett's work. So we want to rebuild this a little bit. Okay. The return to sports progression I talked about last week in the ankle one, but I'll go through it quickly again here. There's a lot of people want to know it, particularly in relation to ACL injuries and coming back from some of these harder knee surgeries. Okay, there is great research out there, but we don't have a lot of awesome research on particular stuff. It's a project I'm working on now with some great surgeons. But essentially, I usually make a 4 to 8 week program that slowly increases the amount of force that someone's going to take in that repetition, that volume. Okay, the variables that we manipulate here will be the surface that they're tumbling on, that they're working on, the number of repetitions they're doing, and the force per skill going from basics to harder skills. Okay, so I typically set these up as 3 times per week with 24 hours off in between. And I want to make sure that their home program and their PT strength program is being done on the days that they're not training or during their workouts, maybe on an off event. But essentially, every 2 weeks, I progress these people. So we go first 2 weeks, it will be on the softer surfaces. We'll be doing drills and basics and easier landing strategies. And we'll be doing a very low repetition count. Okay. The second 2 weeks, from weeks 3 to week 4, we'll progress them to a softer surface and a medium surface together. We'll progress them to more skill difficulty, right, with maybe doing more connected skills or single skills. And then we'll progress them to a moderate repetition volume of impact, right? The 5th and the 6th week, we'll go to medium and hard surfaces split. Harder skills were being done, more connected tumbling, more connected vaulting and landing, and then a higher skill volume, right? Lastly, in week 7 to 8, it's a harder surface. We're probably opening up to the judicious use of skill repetitions, which is probably just keep it under 7 per skill per day. But I'm allowing them to kind of go. And every 2 weeks, I monitor their symptoms to make sure they're not getting swelling, flaring up, soreness, whatever else it is. They feel comfortable. Their strength program's going well. But we progress these every 2 weeks based on their skills. So if they're level 7 or a level 5 and they're doing low-level skills, we just progress those easy. If they're an optional gymnast, you want to make sure you spread out some of these impacts across these 8 weeks so that you're not overloading one day or one specific time. Okay, so even when someone's cleared, quote unquote, at 3 months, I might still make them go through a 4 to 8 week progression of progressive return to sport like we see in baseball or tennis or golf to reduce the risk of re-injury, but also mentally get them confident back to what the skills that they're doing. Okay. So I try to be very careful about the workload management during this period of time. I'm not throwing a ton at them. I'm trying to manage how much they're doing impact volume week to week. We monitor with, RPE scales or impact, trackers and stuff like that. But generally, we're trying to make sure that we're going through this nice, slow, progressive process. All right. And now we'll get to the back end of this right here, just trying to wrap things up a little bit. So let's just wrap things up with what are the modifiable factors that we can do. Okay. Number one, by far and away, I'm going to say this till I die, proper science-based strength and conditioning programs, which means gymnastics-based bodyweight stuff, core, leg lifts, rope climbs, handstands, jump squats, sprints, all the great leg tightening stuff you have. Pair that with great evidence-based strength conditioning. So squatting, deadlifting, hinging, split squats, pelvis, step up, all that kind of stuff, split pelvis, all that kind of stuff, single leg. Pair those things together and you'll have a very robust, capable athlete in the off season who can become a very durable person in the in season, right? That is the most important thing that we can do, is a proper strength conditioning program that's balanced based off explosive power goals. But also, along with that, another thing is teaching proper jumping and landing patterns. Crucial that we're doing this. And it's getting better and better with information. We have to make this, everybody's warm-up should have jumping and landing patterns, single and double leg patterns, just like soccer does with the FIFA 11, right? We need to standardize. Everyone should be doing this, jumping and landing progressions, to make sure they're safe. And we need to change the rules so they're not deducted for these landing deductions if they do land in a safe way, okay? Third thing along with this, workload monitoring must continue to be a focus of us. We have to know how many impacts we're doing per week. We have to know how many impacts per month, and we can plan those things. We have to know the force per skill on, tumble track versus trampoline versus floor versus vault versus whatever else it is. So coaches have better tools of periodization and progression, and that we can have ways to monitor impact. Like I really want to do a study with impact accelerometers on someone's shins for the course of a season and see how much load they take, or even a month, whatever else it should be in preseason. We need that data. We need that data to do it. So I'm involved in some projects, but we really need more there. Okay. Along with this, looking at excellent technique for skill work, not just chucking skills, right? Perfect basics, flawless execution of handstands, tumbling, teaching stiffness, teaching proper jumping and landing, proper bounding patterns, right? The impact of connected tumbling, to know that air awareness, to not maybe have a buckling event, but also proper landing patterns. That is very, very important. Continuing to combat some of the issues around early specialization and year-round training, really, really important as well to have that discussion as we talked about in the beginning. Continuing soft tissue flexibility updates, evidence-based soft tissue flexibility, make sure the hip is mobile, the ankle joint has enough flexibility. We want to see that ankle maybe bending to 30 degrees, which is about 4 to 5 inches on a closed chain dorsiflexion test. So knowing how to screen that, knowing how to work on that, really, really important with foam rolling, soft tissue work. Eccentric calf lowers are another great way to do that. Regular stretching of the joint and of the ankle itself to get that around the kinetic chain. That's really, really important. And then lastly, I'll just say just culture, right? Culture in general, of having a culture that is built around communication and trust and speaking up about your injuries and knowing that it's better to deal with an injury early, particularly like these patellar tendon, these, cranky soft tissue injuries, these overuse type stuff like that, these bone bruises. The better you can deal with it head on right away, I promise you it's better. I've unfortunately treated thousands of issues in the knee, ankle, hip, all that kind of stuff. And I can always tell you that those that don't speak up and just the gymnasts that want to be a warrior and push through it, they almost always have bigger headaches down the road or something unfortunately happens. So build a culture of trust, communication, work in multidisciplinary teams with athletic trainers, strength coaches, gymnastics coaches, all working together with parents and gymnasts, nutritionists, very important, mental psychology people, mental skills training. Crucial that you have an evidence-based team all working together to really make sure that that's super important. All right. And then my last kind of parting thought is, what do you do for people who are not making progress? What if someone constantly has knee pain? They can never quite get back. They're always limited. Here are the biggest things that I talk about with people. And it takes an honest, really brutal conversation sometimes, but starting with culture, are your goals aligned, right? Does the coach have the same goals? The gymnast have the same goals? The medical provider have the same goals? The parent, the same goals? The strength coach? If sometimes what happens, and I see, is that as athletes get older, their goals change. They don't really want to do high level gymnastics. They want to do a different program. They want to do a different sport. They don't want to train. They just want to be with their friends. And they keep getting pushed to this high level they don't want to be in. No one wants to speak up with it because it's really awkward, but the person gets rushed back too soon and they flare up again and they can't get through it. But no one ever said like, hey, I actually don't want to do this event. I want to be a specialist. I don't really want to go to college anymore. I want to do 2 sports. I want to play something else. I want to go, focus on my academics. I want to be a kid and have fun with my friends. Sometimes I don't want to get back to it, and that's totally okay. Okay. So you got to recognize that. Second, a lack of communication. If you don't have an honest communication around what's going on, when are we planning for what meets, what are the skills we want to do, what level do we want to get to, what are the goals this year, what are the goals next year? If you don't have that fluid communication and really professional candor where you can have a conversation with someone and not hurt their feelings and just talk about what the reality of the situation is, if you don't have that skill of verbal and nonverbal communication, it gets lost in translation and you start to assume or jump to conclusions and no one ever gets a clear message and it always falls apart. Okay. Along with that, you want to make sure you're in a culture that's not kind of going by the fear and no trust, right? Just saying, oh, don't worry about it. Your knee doesn't hurt, or it's just growing pains, or do 10 more because I said so, like that kind of crap, right? You need to be in a place that doesn't have that toxic culture that's fear led and that someone's worried about coming back or missing their spot or something like that. You have to have a supportive, nurturing culture that understands that injuries are part of the sport and they're unavoidable sometimes, and that sometimes someone's doing everything they possibly can and it's still just taking time. And that's frustrating for everybody, but that's the nature of the beast with gymnastics. So lastly is kind of around patience. Is maybe you're just coming back too fast too soon, right? Maybe you're trying to get back for a meet, or you're trying to get back for a showcase, or you just want to be with your friends and you're skipping steps. You're not doing a full advanced and return to sport phase. You're going from the intermediate phase, like, oh, my pain's kind of gone, so I'm going to try some tumble track, or my pain's kind of gone, so I'll just try this meet. I'll just try a couple things, and you get back too fast and you flare yourself up. I've found that you can't outpace biology. You have to respect these healing timelines and really respect how long it takes, and make sure that sometimes you don't feel pain during the exercise you're doing, but the next day you have this kind of hangover effect where 2 or 3 days later, you're like, oh, I'm starting to feel my knee a little bit, or a week or two goes by and you're like, oh, no, I'm starting to feel a little bit. So you got to pace these things out and have a nice respected timeline and be patient. I know it's hard. I know it's challenging, but the blessing of gymnastics, there's so many things that you can work on given the situation around that. Okay. So culture is a big one. Workloads, I think, is also, along with that too fast, too soon kind of thing, is make sure the surfaces are being rotated. Make sure you're having someone who is not spending all their time on hard or just doing, hard landings all the time, using soft and medium surfaces, use the mats to our advantage, use the different technologies we have to make sure someone is prepared for the thing they're doing. I want you to get ready for the meet you're coming up for over the course of 8 weeks, but I don't want you to be like, oh my God, the meet's coming, and just throw everybody on hard, right? Or something I've seen sometimes happen is they just do, we're changing the warm-up, right? We're changing the warm-up. We're doing more jumps, more leaps, more tumbling, blah, blah, blah. And like all these kids' knees go through cranky Osgood Schlatters because someone throws 1,000 impacts at them and they do plyomat panels like for, ages. And there's a whole different discussion of why that's not great for cardio, but they throw tons of stuff at someone in an acute period, or sometimes it's not malicious. They're just like, oh, I found this great new drill online and I want to try it on vault. And they throw this drill at all the athletes. They do it 4 days in a row and everyone's knees get really, really sore. So just be thoughtful and reflective of how to slowly increase those things over time. Okay. And then sometimes people really do need to modify their skills. They just can't tolerate back handsprings. They can't tolerate back tucks on beam. They can't tolerate really hard flipping vaults. They need a twist. They can't tolerate this dismount, right? So you need to modify their skill profile, maybe in the short term, even if that means the start value is lower or they're only doing 2 events instead of 4, at least they can get back fully and make sure that they're kind of like going back if they have their skills that are, able to be handled mentally and physically. I'll just put it at that. So have that conversation, have an open mindset about that kind of stuff. All right. So that does it, right? A casual 2-hour, 15-minute podcast episode, but I wanted to make sure I went slow and I broke these things down because the response from the first couple were really, really positive, and these will stand the test of time. Hopefully I'll always add more to the blog post. I'll add, pieces to this podcast if people want it, but I want to make sure that people have a comprehensive, really great guide to go back to when they have all these problems they're dealing with. If you guys want to learn more about this, for coaches, we have an option called the Hero Lab, which is like a webinar-based thing I do where I answer questions, and I have 40, 50 lectures on there that people will join if you want to support the podcast. If you're a medical provider and you want to know exactly every single thing I do for rehab, we have a athletic training and PT approved CEU course that's 8.5 units for CEUs called Recent Advances in the Evaluation and Treatment of Lower Extremity Injuries in Gymnastics. So if you want to check that out, go to the website, go to courses.shiftmovementscience.com, and you can find all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I won't go any longer. I hope this was helpful. If you guys enjoyed this and you just want to digest the information, just please post it, share it, because obviously this takes a lot of work for me to spend hours and hours making these, but share it with the community so that I know that the impact is positive and that people are getting a lot of good information that's science-based and high quality and at no cost to them too. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you guys so much for being a part of it, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.